give this just a minute to see if more people are joining in, and then we'll get started. Great, okay. So I'll kick off this workshop. My name's Leanne Jackson. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the head of the Agri-Food Trade and Markets Division in the Trade and Agriculture Directorate at the OECD. I've been in this role for just over 2 years, and I joined after about 16 years at the World Trade Organization, where among other roles, I served as the secretary to the Committee on Agriculture. As you know, my team at the OECD has been working on agricultural trade and food systems, and we also produce an annual flagship report with the FAO on the agricultural outlook on agriculture commodity market projections. This will be released on the 29th of June in about 2 weeks' time. We're also involved, as you may know, in developing standards for seeds, tractors, forests, and fruits and vegetables. So we have a lot of work that interacts with this interface between agricultural systems, agricultural and food systems, and trade. And today we're really excited to be with you to explore issues around sustainable agricultural production and trade. We're very fortunate to have had a voluntary contribution by the Australian government to support this event. For your information, we're also recording this meeting so that delegates who can't participate today because of time zone issues can watch it at a later stage. Just a few housekeeping issues before I introduce the content. Could I please ask you to rename yourself, putting your country and or organization first, and then your name. So actually, I haven't done that. I'll do that when I finish speaking, so that I start with OECD and then Leanne Jackson. To do this, you can click on the participants button at the top of the Zoom window, hover your mouse over your name in participants, the participants list on the right side of the Zoom window, and then click on rename. And then you can enter the name that you'd like, again, beginning with your country or organization. By including these kinds of this kind of information in our naming, we hope that that's helping people make connections, especially in this virtual setting where we can't be in person. Please also, if you're able, leave your cameras on, because that gives us a sense that we're really here interacting with each other. The workshop is planned for 3 hours. It's starting at noon Paris time and will finish at 3 p.m. We have 3 sessions that will run about 50 minutes each, and we're really excited. We have an impressive lineup of experts from governments, business, and research institutes to help us think about this complicated topic. We're also planning to have time for question and answers, and we'll have a few little interactive moments with polls and exercises to get some interaction with the audience. So hopefully that will keep everyone engaged. So that is the housekeeping. Now, if I can just spend a couple of minutes introducing the topic before I pass over to Annalise Duce, who will be moderating the first session. We know, and we've been talking for a couple of years about the fact that agriculture and food systems are facing a formidable triple challenge. We need the system to ensure food security for a growing global population. We need to make sure that the system is able to provide livelihoods along the food chain. And to do both these things, we also expect food systems to be able to contribute to the sustainability of the sector and, importantly, its contribution to climate change mitigation. We have these big deadlines approaching, the deadlines for the Zero Hunger Sustainable Development Goal in 2030. And also we need to be thinking about keeping emissions on track to meet the Paris agricultural targets. And those deadlines that we have set for ourselves are fast approaching. And so we need actually to be thinking about how to amplify our response and create action to achieve these big goals. So we need specifically the agricultural sector to do more with less. And we need to think also about sustainable productivity growth in order to be able to move the sector in a direction that helps us achieve these goals. Governments obviously have a role to play, but also the private sector is already taking action. So this workshop is going to help us see sort of the landscape of actions that are currently in the scene. The workshop is focusing specifically on the agricultural trade aspect. So we want to talk about potential impacts of domestic measures that are being implemented, especially with a view to improving the sustainability and thinking about trade, how it affects the trading system as well. So we're looking forward to hearing lots of experiences and examples from our experts who are here. A bit of background on the OECD. We've been conducting research and facilitating discussions on policies that are in this intersection of trade and the environment for almost 30 years, at least 30 years. Our recent research has described policy trends in relation to sustainability measures and also spillover effects that these have on trade. So we've had topics related to looking at the sustainability provisions and impacts of free trade agreements. We have also had work on carbon taxes and their impact on emissions. We have had work on how different agricultural policy reforms may affect climate change adaptation. And also we've had work on the environmental performance of agriculture and more generally how policies have an impact on the sustainability of agricultural production. We're currently also working on a project that's looking at pathways to align agricultural environment and trade policies. So you can see the OECD has had a long history and is also currently very invested in trying to create good evidence and analysis for these topics, and also to have events like this one to facilitate discussions and learning among our members. So we're really looking forward to the discussions and observations that we hear from this workshop. The ideas that will be shared today will also have the possibility of contributing to discussions that are leading into the OECD Agricultural Ministers meeting. That meeting will happen on the 3rd and 4th of November, and the theme for the meeting is building sustainable agriculture and food systems in a changing environment, shared challenges, transformative solutions. We're hoping in that event, we create the possibility for ministers to exchange on innovative and forward-looking policies that will work from plate to planet and also set the agenda for the next 6 years of OECD's work on agriculture. So already you can see that these discussions have high relevance to the discussions that can take place later this year at the ministerial. The ministerial is also is taking place at an important moment, also because it's 1 week before the 27th session of the Conference of the Parties to the UN Climate Change Convention. So with that as a context for the meeting, I think we're planning to run a poll. I'm just double checking that our system is ready to go for that. So as this poll is being loaded, I'm looking to colleagues. There we go. You can see the question is, what are the 3 elements of sustainability in agricultural production that are most important for your country? So if you could please go ahead and submit your responses. Up to 3, I think, is possible. And we can see how those responses come in from this group. I'm just looking to colleagues to see if we will then share the results of the poll.
Yeah, we will share the results. Evan, I'm just looking how many people have completed it. And so far we're at the halfway mark. So
shall we go on and we can share results?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay. So please go ahead and put in your answers. We'll share the results once we have a critical mass of answers. So now at this point, I'd like to hand over to my colleague, Annalise, who's going to moderate the first session of the workshop. Over to you.
Thank you, Leanne, and welcome everyone to the first session of the workshop. So in this session, we will focus on country practices and experiences with defining, measuring, and managing agricultural sustainability. So my name is Annelies Deus. I work in the Agri-Food Trade and Markets Division, where I lead the work on agricultural trade. And I'm the secretary of the OECD's Joint Working Party on Agriculture and Trade. So we have 3 speakers joining us in this session who will briefly share how their governments are defining and measuring their sustainable agricultural production priorities. So sustainable agricultural production can mean different things in different contexts and can even differ within countries, depending on the environmental and other challenges governments and local authorities are facing. So in this session, our speakers will focus on 3 key questions, namely, first of all, what are the current priorities for their governments and which policy measures are they using to achieve these priorities? Secondly, how is success of these policies defined and measured? And third, how are their governments managing the trade impacts of these domestic policy interventions? So you most probably have the program in front of you, so you might already have looked at the background of our speakers, so I won't spend too much time introducing them. So our first speaker today is Elise Golan. She is the Director for Sustainable Development for the USDA. In her role, Elise provides leadership in planning, coordinating, and analyzing the USDA's various policies, programs, and activities that impact and relate to sustainable agricultural, natural resource, and community development, including food security. Elise, I now pass to you for your intervention.
Thank you, Annelies. And because I'm having such difficulties with the connection, I'm using my phone for audio. Does that work for you? Can you hear me? Okay, I don't want to take any risks. A thunderstorm seems to have passed, but you never know. So thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to join you all for this interesting discussion. And in my short 7 minutes, I'm going to provide a brief overview of the U.S. approach to sustainable agriculture production. I'm going to highlight some new initiatives and core U.S. principles related to sustainable agriculture and trade. So the next slide. Are the slides up? Okay. I cannot see. Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so the U.S. approach to sustainability is firmly anchored by the 3 dimensions of sustainable development, the social, economic, and environmental dimensions. And the sustainability of a system is judged by its ability to deliver on those objectives. Bring some technical. The objectives include, among others, providing safe and nutritious food for all, providing decent incomes and wages for farmers and those working across the system, and conserving natural resources for the benefit of current and future populations. Next slide, please. Sustainability is not a new concept at USDA, and I want to emphasize this to illustrate how deeply entrenched the 3 pillars are at USDA. The concept stretches back in a formal sense to the 1977 and 1990 Farm Bills, that describes sustainable agricultural development as an integrated system of plant and animal production practices, having a site-specific application that will, over the long term, satisfy human and fiber needs, enhance environmental quality, make the most efficient use of non-renewable resources and on-farm resources, sustain the economic viability of farm operations, and enhance the quality of life for farmers and society as a whole. Okay, well, this is all fine and good. The question is, how do you translate this into action on the ground and to real outcomes? So that brings me, next slide, please, to a fundamental principle underpinning USDA's approach to sustainability and trade. And that is the importance of science-based metrics. We simply cannot categorize particular approaches as sustainable or unsustainable. We must evaluate our efforts to improve sustainability against measurable outcomes. We have to do the hard work of assessing real impacts and outcomes in specific geographies and social and market contexts. Marketing of products with sustainability claims, whether in domestic or global markets, should be based on evidence that the marketed food was produced using the advertised sustainability practice, and that these sustainability practices generated real, measurable sustainability benefits. Next slide, please. Well, how do we do the hard work of assessing real impacts and outcomes? I'm going to do a fast drill down on an important element of environmental sustainability, and that's greenhouse gas emissions and efforts to reduce them. Take a look at the COMET tools that USDA developed with Colorado State University. These COMET tools include models and databases that implement more than 40 USDA peer-reviewed methods and models that estimate greenhouse gas emissions within a farm or a ranch. The tools provide carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide estimates based on management, soils, and climate. Next slide, please. This is such a cool tool. This next slide, I'm putting up this slide with access information. I'm encouraging you all to take a look. COMET is a great demonstration of the way that government, through public good R&D and the provision of publicly available tools, can support voluntary private efforts to advance environmental sustainability and empower farmers and producers to choose the practices that work best in their context. So next slide, just one more fast slide on COMET, just to demonstrate the extent to which the impact estimates are tailored to specific geolocation and management practices. This yellow text says, zoom to your parcels, then use one of the add parcel buttons to define each parcel location. Each parcel must have a unique management history. That's the detail of this tool. Okay, next slide. Another exciting effort supported by USDA targeting greenhouse gas emissions is the Partnership for Climate Smart Commodities. This initiative will provide $1 billion of grant funding to partners to implement large-scale pilot projects that first implement climate smart production practices, activities, and systems on working lands, and then measure, quantify, monitor, and verify the carbon and greenhouse gas benefits associated with those practices, and then develop markets and promote the resulting climate smart commodities. There's two funding pools for this, for climate smart commodities. The first funding pool accepted proposals from $5 million to $100 million. We're talking big money. The second funding pool accepted proposals for $250,000 to about $5 million. Now, this initiative is designed to tick all three dimensions of sustainability, the economic and environmental, and equity and inclusion. Projects in both funding pools have to demonstrate meaningful benefits to small or historically underserved producers. The second funding pool will specifically prioritize projects that benefit these types of producers. The first round closed in May. On May 6th, we got over 450 proposals with applications from over 350 groups that covered every state in the nation, as well as tribal lands in the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico. We'll be giving out those awards by the end of the summer. The second pool just closed, so no information on that. So I want to note that this initiative is voluntary, equitable, and accessible. That's our principles of the USDA's approach. It also is non-distortive as far as cropping patterns, right? In general, at the US, as countries move to implement policy frameworks to support sustainable agriculture, the US urges that care must be taken to minimize unintended distortions or consequences on global trade and food security. The US supports efforts to enable a multilateral trade environment of increased transparency and predictability, including through rules-based policies and science-based data-driven decision-making. We view multilateralism as an imperative for tackling complex global challenges. The future work of the multilateral system on trade and the environment, including on climate and sustainability, will be important to demonstrate the value of the multilateral system that the multilateral system can hold in leveraging trade as a tool to address urgent global challenges. The United States was happy to join the Trade and Environment Sustainability Structured Discussion last November. We think that TESID is well positioned to enable discussions among WTO members on trade-related climate measures that complement domestic actions to address climate change. Okay, my last slide here, sliding in at 7 minutes. So I want to remind everyone that as we look at ag sustainability at the farm level or even the field level, we kind of are focused on a micro level. We need to make sure that we don't lose sight of the big picture on sustainability. We can't take our eyes off the continued importance of agricultural productivity growth. Agricultural productivity growth has eased resource constraints facing agriculture, and continued improvement in agricultural productivity growth is critical in the coming decades if agriculture is to keep up with global nutrition needs while protecting the natural resource base on which agriculture depends. We know that agricultural productivity growth has led to a dramatic reduction in global poverty and food insecurity, and continues to be a primary engine of growth in many parts of the world, and will be an engine in helping us deal with the many crises that are confronting us now. We also know that raising the productivity of existing natural resources rather than bringing new natural resources into production is the only viable option to meet food security needs of current and future generations. So for more information about the USDA approach to sustainable productivity growth, including how to join the Sustainable Productivity Growth Coalition, please see our website. I have the link right down there. So thank you very much. Pleasure to join you, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Elise, for your thoughts, and also thank you for giving us vision and sound using two different devices. So next up, we are delighted to be joined by Ireland's Special Envoy for Food Systems, Tom Arnold. Tom chaired the Irish 2030 Agri-Food Strategy Committee, which developed Ireland's latest 10-year food strategy called Food Vision 2030, a world leader in sustainable food systems. And this strategy was launched in August last year. Among other roles on international panels, Tom is the chair of the EU Commission's high-level expert group to assess the need for an international platform for food system science. And Tom has also held the role of chair of the OECD Committee for Agriculture. Tom, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Annalise. I'm supported by a slide presentation with all of 3 slides. I'm telling the story of Ireland's journey on the 16th of June, Bloomsday, the day in which James Joyce's wonderful novel is set. And you see there, it was published 100 years ago by Sylvia Beach and Shakespeare and Company. So this presentation is really very much in honor of James Joyce, but it's influenced by Samuel Beckett, because I hope Samuel Beckett would approve of my decision to describe Ireland's food strategy in 5 words. And I hope Joyce would approve of the fact that when you make an anagram of those 5 words, it comes up with a word called PMAC, which actually doesn't mean anything. So that's my starting point. And I'd like now to go through these 5 words to describe our work. Process. Important to recognize that this food strategy 2030, which is to serve Ireland for the next decade, is the 5th such strategy since 2000. That's important that stakeholders have had the experience of working on national agri-food strategies successively over five periods. The particular group that I chaired was 32 people, representing the range of stakeholders dealing with the agri-food sector. We were asked, and very much connecting to Elise's presentation, we were asked to come up with a strategy and policies to ensure that the Irish agri-food sector would indeed achieve sustainability in its 3 dimensions: economic, environmental, and social. In terms of the innovation that that this particular strategy brought, I think it was particularly around the area that the strategy was developed using a food systems approach, which explicitly recognizes the interconnection between agri-food policy, a policy for the environment, and policies for nutrition and health. And particularly in that latter point, that was very much the first time that a national agri-food strategy has included that dimension. The other key aspect of the food strategy approach is that clearly all of the major actors along the food chain have their role each to play in working towards a sustainable food system. And the third innovation, I think, was the issue of coherence, which I'll speak about at the end of the presentation. In terms of missions, we boiled down our strategy to really 4 core missions for this strategy. Each mission then had objectives and goals at different levels, but the 4 core missions were to achieve a climate-smart, environmentally sustainable agri-food sector, to have viable and resilient primary producers with enhanced well-being, to have food that is safe, nutritious and appealing, trusted and valued at home and abroad, and finally to have an innovative, competitive and resilient agri-food sector driven by technology and talent. So they are the 4 key missions of our, which should guide our Irish agri-food strategy up to 2030. In terms of accountability, which is obviously a message that has to be learned from previous strategies, that if you commit to something, it has to be delivered. There is now in place, after this strategy, I think, a very well developed structure of accountability. There's an overall implementation committee chaired by the Minister for Agriculture, and there are subgroups working to that committee, in particular in the field of the area of the agri-environment. And then the final issue I want to talk about is the question of coherence. The fact that if Ireland is committing to sustainable food systems in its domestic policy, that should be reflected in its foreign policy. And that was of particular relevance last year when you had 4 important international meetings relating to food: the UN Food System Summit, the COP Biodiversity meeting, COP on Climate, and the Nutrition for Growth. So the Irish positioning at all of those meetings was informed by the work of our Food Vision 2030. The end of the day, this Food Vision 2030 document, as is said in its name, it indicates that Ireland wishes to be a leader in sustainable food systems over the next decade, and that's what we are working towards. So, Annalise, I hope I'm within my 7 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. And the last speaker in this session is Alwyn Kops. He is the head of International Affairs and Food Security from the Swiss Federal Office for Agriculture. Alwyn co-leads the Sustainable Food Systems program of the One Planet Network. And as you may know, One Planet Network is a global community of representatives from governments, businesses, civil society, academia, and international organizations that implements the 10-year framework of programs on sustainable consumption and production and works towards achieving Sustainable Development Goal 12, ensuring sustainable patterns of consumption and production. Alwyn, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Annalise. Thanks for the kind invitation, and thank you also that I can be part of this important discussion. So I'll talk a little bit about the Switzerland's practice and experience and the history of our approach towards agriculture, sustainability, and trade. So next slide, please. So let me probably start with our federal constitution. We in 1996 we introduced in our constitution an article a new article on agriculture, and that article very much introduced the multifunctional role of agriculture. So role has to serve as providing the population with food, but it also has to upkeep countryside and to help conserve natural resources, and it has a role to play in rural development. So checking out for the decentralized settlement of the country. So I think in that we see that we have on one hand side these different roles that agriculture has to serve, and also we see the notion of a sustainability, in particular here in terms of environmental sustainability. Then in 2017 we amended our constitution to add an article on food security. Now, why is this interesting here? Of course, because agriculture has a big role to play, but this article changes somewhat a little bit the perspective. It introduces a food systems approach. So in order to provide for food security in Switzerland, you have to do different things, not only on the agriculture production, but going beyond. What you see there in bold is it requires that cross-border trade relations have to contribute to sustainable development of the agriculture and food sector. You also see that there is a notion on using food in a way that conserves natural resources. This talks certainly also about a food waste, for example, but also the notion of meeting market requirements, so that agriculture really is also a question of a demand. You have to a response to demand. So that's the two constitutional provisions we have to work in. And now next slide, please. Just to show you a little bit, where is agriculture taking place in Switzerland? We basically have three very different zones. We have the Alps and the Jura, to a hilly or mountainous regions where agriculture is really very, very hard. You see in the Jura, you have rather big farms, a lot of livestock, while in the Alps, there's small farming structures, a lot of livestock as well. And then you have the plain between Geneva and the Lake of Constance. That's more or less flat land. That's where you have very intensive agriculture, but you actually you have agriculture almost in an urban space from Geneva to the Lake of Constance. That you have the most of the populations that live there, so it's quite a densely populated area. You also see we have the minority of farms are in the lowlands, in the plains. The majority is in hills or farms. So but we still have quite a diverse agriculture system. So how do we try to manage that? Let me have the next slide. What you see here is we reformed agriculture policy since 1992, so it's a very long process. We try to introduce more sustainability considerations into agriculture, a policy. This is also all a science-based, of course. And interestingly, this change was triggered by trade. You know, the prospective results of the Uruguay round made it necessary that we had to decouple price from income policies, and then from there we took it. What we have today is a system that a large part of agriculture support is now subject to environmental requirements. You have in this little house on the left hand side, you see the foundation is cross compliance. If you want to receive direct payments, you have to comply with a certain environmental requirements. So you have to have a proof of ecological performance. And then these pillars you see there, these are programs you can actually choose from. So we have one on biodiversity, payments for production systems, resource efficiency, landscape, farmland management. All these are programs where farms can apply to. They have then to present in general a plan how they want to fulfill these requirements, and will be tested or checked against that through reporting and checks on site. Now on the right hand side, you'll see a little bit of the history. So you really see this is a long history with a different steps we had to take, and always, of course, a checking that we would be a WTO conform. So it was very much also at the beginning driven by trade policies. You see that a development, it's a long one, till 2017, where we introduced that a constitutional a provision I was talking about. And during that time, interestingly, environmental performance was very well advancing at the beginning. And now we found out that it is since 2014, maybe it's getting harder and harder to make a progress on the environmental and but also the social dimension of sustainability. So kind of the next slide. This brought us to a little bit of a change in approach. Let's say the federal council, so the federal government introduced in 2021 the Sustainable Development Strategy 2030, where we try to implement a food systems approach in order to help achieve the 2030 development agenda. So the government said that the transformation of food systems is one of the major tools we have to promote sustainable development in Switzerland. It set out four objectives for food systems. One concerns the consumption side, so we would like to see the proportion of the Swiss population nourishing themselves according to nutritional recommendations, growing by up to 1/3. Today we are about below 10%. We would like to halve food loss and food waste by 2030, based on the baseline of 2017. We have a decrease of the carbon footprint from food consumption by 1/4 compared to 2020, and we want to see an increase of the proportion of farms that engage in especially environmental and animal-friendly production methods by 1/3, also compared to 2020. So you see, we try to address a consumption, a transformation of food, but also production of food. And this strategy is accompanied by action plans, which we will have 4-year action plans, through which we try to implement this strategy and achieve the targets. So we have a system in place where we really try to, through involving different ministries, to move forward towards integrating more sustainability in food systems overall, and not only in agriculture production. So can I have the next slide? The problem is we still have a challenge, which is the growing expectation on agriculture and food systems in terms of sustainability. Now you have to know that in Switzerland, it's rather easy to change the constitution. The population can do that. You have to collect 100,000 signatures for a specific text, and then this will be presented to Parliament and to a public vote if you want to try to change the constitution. And we had several attempts in recent years on the use of pesticides, the quality of drinking water. We're going to have one in the fall on industrial ranching, so livestock management, and so on and so forth. We have in Parliament a lot of motions, postulates coming up, all addressing points of sustainability. Some want to have more, some want to have less. And I think next slide, this shows very well kind of the tension triangle we have. We have food security, we have trade, we have agriculture and food systems. They all have to play a role. They all influence each other, and we have these big challenges of climate change, soil erosion, loss of biodiversity, and so on and so forth. So we really try to get that system in balance and in an equilibrium. We are a net importing country. Trade is very, very important to us. We have about 50% of what we eat we import in Switzerland, and we really try to get this balance right. So we, with the introduction of the constitutional provision on food security, we have this role that trade has to play a role in food, in sustainable development of food production. I think that's important. So what do we try to do on the international side? Next slide. What we try to do, we try to foster the understanding of sustainable agriculture and food system in international fora. That's very much a dialogue we need to have with all other players involved. We do that through FAO, UNEP, OECD. We are involved in multi-stakeholder platforms and partnerships, as we need to walk this path to sustainability together. Then on the trade side itself, so with regard to trade instruments, we have WTO. We also there we are a member of TSSD, which for many years now we try to promote this multifunctional role of agriculture. In bilateral trade agreements, with the agreement with Indonesia, we for the first time integrated a product-specific condition on palm oil. So if you have sustainably certified palm oil, is treated differently than other palm oil. And we try to establish and introduce a dialogue platform, so using free trade agreements to further the dialogue on sustainable food systems and sustainable agriculture. And then, of course, another instrument we have is the equivalency arrangements on organic agriculture with different countries. I think that's a very pragmatic way of trying to facilitate trade in a market segment, which is organic agriculture, that is very important to Swiss consumers. And finally, we work with actors, be it in developing countries, with market access facilitation work, so a lot around a sustainability, a criteria, and based on OECD work, we try to promote responsible business conduct for companies based or operating in Switzerland. That's from my side. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Alwyn. So listening to these three very interesting presentations definitely gave us a lot of food for thought. So in the next 20 minutes, we'll invite you, the audience, to ask some questions. So while you're thinking about those questions, let me just reflect on a few key observations that I've picked up from our speakers. So first of all, from Elise's presentation, I really appreciated the messages around the measurement and evidence. Namely, it's important that efforts towards improving sustainability should be measured against measurable outcomes, and that we need evidence that food is produced using sustainable practices, and also evidence that these practices generate benefits. So this focus on which evidence to collect and how to measure efforts is crucial, especially because we cannot do any impact or outcome assessments without definitions, evidence, and measures. Then from Tom's presentation, I think we will all remember the new word PIMAC, which is composed of the first letters of the 5 keywords that summarize Ireland's 2030 agri-food strategy, namely process, innovation, mission, accountability, and coherence. And especially related to this workshop, the last word, coherence, really makes this link between domestic and international strategies. And then from Alwyn's presentation, I was particularly interested in the objectives that are listed in the 2030 Sustainability Development Strategy, which are quite ambitious. And again, it will be interesting to see how the government plans to implement and measure progress towards these objectives. Okay, so now for the next 20 minutes, I'm opening up the floor and give you the audience the opportunity to ask questions. So you can ask your questions either via the chat, or you can raise your virtual hand. And it would be great if you could indicate which of the speakers you'd like to respond to your question. Yes, we have a first question from Roberto Azofeiva.
Thank you, Annelies. Thank you, Alvin and Elise for sharing the experiences and data from the countries. Reflecting about the presentations, it comes to my mind that sustainability in agricultural sector is much easier if the government, the society invest money, for farmers to implement technologies to produce in terms of sustainability, especially in terms of environmental issues. So my question is, without this kind of support, do you think it is possible? How to do it without this, if the market is not if the market does not pay for the cost of the implementation of technologies in the field? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. Is there someone in particular you would like to ask this question to, Roberto, or?
Well, I would like to hear the comments from Alvin and Elise, because both talk about payments and money from the society to apply in the agricultural sector.
Thank you. So, Alwyn.
Yeah, thank you very much, Roberto, and really good to see you today. I mean, yes, indeed, you have a very important point is about true cost to value of food, I think, and there needs to be work ongoing. How can we integrate and how our prices reflecting the true costs of food and true value of food. So indeed, I think it makes it much easier if you have public money to put into the system, but you have to be careful to do it right, so to put it on the right, set the right incentives, and so that certainly helps. But we also, it would be much harder, of course, without, and it has to do with true cost, true value. But what we see recently, at least, is that business very much has a lot of initiatives ongoing to make what they are doing a greener, so to say, so to be stronger on the sustainability side. I think that also has to do with the awareness that they really have to take care of their production, of their business model, of their basis, well, what they are working from. So regenerative agriculture, for example, is something that is a broadly used in the business community. So I think nowadays it would be easier to introduce a more sustainability, environmental sustainability, also through the private sector, because they're doing a lot. I think that's easier today than maybe 20 years ago, where it was really important that in our case that the government was setting some incentives. Thank you.
Thank you, Alwyn.
I'm just going to.
Oh, yes, go ahead, Elisa. I was just going to invite
okay.
you and Tom, if you have any, if you would like to share your thoughts as well, please go ahead.
Yes, just really quickly. I mean, there's a number of different ways that governments can support and help facilitate market development. And one major difficulty for private sector, farmers, ranchers, anyone trying to provide and create goods that are embedded with sustainability attributes is proving it. And so through investments in research and development, through investments on tools to help farmers actually prove that their practices are delivering the benefits as advertised. I think that's an incredibly important role for government at the private sector. It's a public good that government can supply to facilitate these markets. Over.
Annalise, I'd be happy to contribute as well. I think every country has got its own challenges here, and I think it has to be brought down to very practical terms. The link between, in the Irish case, the link between agriculture and the environment was particularly marked in the area of emissions from livestock, water quality, and biodiversity. So what we had to do in our strategy was to set out what improvements we wanted to achieve over the period of time, and set down how they could be achieved. Some of that would be achieved through a research program, which will, try to develop answers to some of the problems. Some of it will be, I think, achieved through supporting farmers and actually paying farmers to work towards producing environmental goods. And certainly part of that is apart from the money end of things, I think you're going to farmers have to be brought on board in terms of they accepting their role in improving the environment. Because most farmers want to do that. They don't want to be portrayed as, if you like, damaging the environment. So it's going to be a multifaceted approach to tackling problems. But it is very clear that most societies at this point want higher environmental standards, and where the agri sector has a critical role in helping achieve those.
Thank you, both Tom and Elise, for those answers. Next up, I see we have a question from the UK, from Marco Franzoi.
Hi everyone, thank you for the very interesting presentations and discussion. I had a question that I think it might be for everybody, but specifically to comments that come from Elise and Alwyn on kind of the global approach. So I think in the US presentation, it was mentioned there was a global approach to sustainability. So I'm guessing that also meant looking at products being imported into the country. And similarly, when we're talking about the Swiss plan, trade relation was clarified as being a key component in reaching sustainability in the country. But it was just very interesting whether to do so, is that something, what kind of tools have been used? How is that actually in practice included? Are we talking about using, for example, the COMET tools that were mentioned before for imports? Are we talking about other specific tools that have been thought about, simply when we're doing trade strategy that has to be taken into account in some way or another? So I guess a bit more higher level. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. So Elise?
Sure. So can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think so. I wasn't suggesting that the COMET tool would be useful for evaluating imports. I think that the COMET tool, what it illustrates is how important it is to do these type of analyses for specific geographies. That's why we can't say one approach is always more sustainable. One agricultural approach is not always more sustainable. What works in a cranberry bog here in the United States is not going to work in almond groves. You know, so one approach to sustainable agriculture cannot be applied around the world. And then my point, the bigger point about as we look at sustainability, how are we describing our boundaries? Whether we're thinking about circular systems, whether we're thinking about you know, these problems that are facing us as citizens of the world. How do we set the boundaries as we're analyzing these problems? And as we set different boundaries, how does that change the answer we get? I think it's just very interesting to think about that. Over.
Thank you, Elise. And I was wondering, Tom or Alwyn, if you would like to share your thoughts on that question. No? Oh, okay.
I think just very quickly, I had a bit of hard time to get the entire question because I kind of faded out of the system for a while. But I think what is important, and Tom, I mentioned, is kind of the coherence between a internal and external policies. And what we note is that there is a pressure coming up from the population through these popular initiatives. They all touch upon trade. They all show that there is an expectation there in the population that they would like to see more sustainably produced products coming into Switzerland, and of course that there we are bound by trade rules. Not everything is possible, but what we did in a bilateral approach is really with Indonesia for the first time differentiate a product based on whether it is a certified through a standard that is mutually recognized to be a sustainable or more sustainable than a non-certified product that concerns the palm oil. But I think it's very important what Elise also said, that this is a case-by-case approach. You cannot treat everybody the same and every country, every region the same. That's why we also try to integrate through our trade tools, trade agreements, we have the notion of having a platform for dialogue, already foster the understanding on what are sustainability issues in the different countries involved, and then work from there. So I think that's kind of our approach. That's our kind of trying to be coherent with what we do internally and externally. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alwyn and Elise, for those answers. I see we have one more question from FAO, from Tomislav Ivanchik.
Hello, hi colleagues, good morning, good afternoon. My name is Tomislav. I work for the Food and Agriculture Organization as an advisor on responsible agricultural supply chains and responsible business conduct. So I'm very happy to be here today and listen to these conversations. We heard some really great, in my view, some really great interventions from all our speakers. I'd like to ask a little bit some particular questions about implementation. Right, we've heard that free trade agreements, particularly in the case of the EU, even in their trade and sustainable development chapters of EU FTAs, have been encouraging sustainability for years, right? However, there have been mixed results in reality, right? And the same comes in other OECD countries, right? And we do have a very great effort and a lot of momentum to try to address environmental and social issues in supply chains in particular, which is what I focus on. But we do have a challenge in defining sustainability in different ways, right? In many European countries, we have an approach that's based on risk-based due diligence, which my dear colleague Shivani Kanabaran will speak to in greater length in the next session. But we also have other OECD countries which don't really encourage the same approach, or might focus on, as we even heard from our last dear speaker as well, circularity. And circularity is a very different approach to understanding sustainability than if an approach is taken to understanding how we can impact human rights or GHG or in different ways, et cetera, right? So I do feel that there is an imbalance kind of in amongst countries as well in how they define sustainability themselves. Now, my question, I promise I'll end here, is really looking at implementation, right? We know that on the opposite side, we're talking about at least low and middle income developing countries that have to pick up the slack for all of these great policies that we're producing at the downstream level, right? So what can you say from your experience, and I'd love to hear from Ireland, from Alvin as well, practical ways that we can work with not only governments, but companies in upstream suppliers that work in context of severe development challenges, right? Where child labor is not a supply chain risk, child labor is a structural development challenge. And as a result, it enters into your supply chains as a result of that, right? And that's the same with water issues and all of these other things. So I'd love to hear a little bit about that, and that would help me very much so in driving my job as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that question. Tom, would you like to answer this question or this question first?
Well, I mean, I don't have any definitive answers for Tomislav, but what I would say is that we're at an early stage in the conversation about the issues that he has dealt with, because to the best of my knowledge, there are no effective international rules around many of these issues. And I think we're only beginning to explore some of these questions, and they're going to become more important. Now, I know later on in the webinar, we will have the benefit of a contribution from Alan Matthews, who has done some work about what the implications for developing countries are of European policies on the environment. And I think that's, again, it will be, I think, an important contribution to the debate. But I mean, I don't have any direct, explicit answers to Tomislav's question based on my own experience and based on the experience of developing our own national agri-food strategy.
Thank you very much, Tom. Wondering if Alwyn, would you like to add something to that?
Yeah, I can try to add something to that. So first of all, thanks, Tomislav, for the question. It's really a big question and a very important one. So I think from the Swiss perspective, and there is no one fits all solution, of course, but a tool that might help in practical terms is when actors work together and try to come up, for example, with a sustainability standard certification schemes. They all bring their challenges with them as well in terms of they exclude some producers while other producers can take advantage of them, of course. But I think that would be a practical tool how you can try to move forward with that. That has been done for quite some while. I think there is also a limit to that, of course, but very important is the notion of working together with actors, so multi-stakeholder platforms that try to break those nice concepts down to really practical work on the ground. But as Tom said, that's such a huge area, and I think that the issues, the challenges are so diverse that it is difficult to give a one silver bullet answer here. I think I can't, but I think the role of the private sector and how we work as governments with the private sector, as governments in the north, but also in the south, that's going to be important in this area. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So yeah, thank you so much to the speakers for their presentations and answers to these questions, and also for the audience for those intriguing and thought-provoking questions. Unfortunately, we have to close this first session now. And so I will now hand over to my colleague, Shivani Kanaviran, who will moderate the second session. Thanks again.
Thanks very much, Annelies. And can everyone hear me? Is it clear, the sound? Great, thank you. Well, good morning, good afternoon to everyone. Welcome to the second session of the workshop today. And I think picking up very nicely from where we left off, we've heard from governments, and now we're going to hear from the private sector. So we have a range of private sector representatives. I'm happy to see that we also have folks from both, I'd say, the developing countries, but also from developed countries as well as emerging economies. So we're going to hear from these representatives about the initiatives that they are taking to respond to agricultural sustainability and to trade. My name is Shivani Kanaviran, and I lead the work on responsible agricultural supply chains globally. And actually this work, we do it at the OECD very closely with the FAO. So you just heard earlier from my colleague in partner in crime, I should say, from the FAO, Tomislav. And that's really the implementation of recommendations of the OECD FAO guidance for responsible agricultural supply chains. And we work very closely actually with a number of companies along the full value chain. So from investors to producers to traders, food and bev manufacturers, all the way to retailers, on implementing what we call due diligence to address these ESG risks in their global food and also the non-food agri-supply chains. And I'm really pleased that on our panel today, we'll have Dave Melson, for example, who's with the New Zealand Merino company, because I know often we talk about ag, we tend to focus on food, but there's also a whole bunch of non-food commodities in the agricultural sector. Right. We've got 4 speakers ahead of us, so I'm going to ask for everyone's cooperation in keeping your initial comments to the rapid. I think we have 3 minutes for each person. And I'd first of all like to ask Martin Hoffler to speak. And Martin is with Ireland's food board, Board Bia, which is communicating to Irish farmers about sustainability and what elements of sustainability are included in Board Bia's Origin Green brand. Martin is the Sustainability Partnership and Development Manager. He's over 10 years of experience working across the private and public organizations and has really in-depth understanding of the sustainability trends. We know that things have really been moving at a great pace in the last 5 to 10 years. There's also a lot of emerging regulation and really on ESG reporting in particular. Martin applies his knowledge in collaboration with the industry, also with NGOs and government departments. And I think Tom was picking up a little on that earlier, on this aspect of collaboration. Martin has been with Board Bia for about 6 years now, and previously he was with the Dairy Sustainability Framework Secretariat and PepsiCo's Sustainable Agricultural Team. So Martin, you have the floor. Welcome.
Thank you, Shivani, for that pleasant introduction. For those of you who are not familiar with Board Bia is the Irish Food Board, an Irish government agency that manages the promotion of trade development and marketing of Irish food, drink, and horticulture produce, both in Ireland and in 15 overseas offices. Board Bia's overseas presence, coupled with authoritative strategic insight, enables Board Bia to pursue emerging opportunities and actively respond to significant market issues that affect industry. Next slide, please. For consumers across the world, there is an increasing expectation of verified sustainability credentials for the food they buy. Therefore, in 2012, Board Bia launched Origin Green to drive and monitor positive change across Ireland's food, drink industry, so Ireland can continue to build and protect a global reputation for food sustainability. This is done through developing a series of methodologies in partnership with multiple government agencies and NGOs to drive improved sustainability credentials across the length of the Irish food and drink supply chain, with 55,000 farmers, over 300 food and drink manufacturers, and with 10 of Ireland's largest food service and retail operators. Over the past 10 years, Origin Green has become a key sustainability enabler across multiple government policies, as well as Food Vision 2030. Next slide, please. Today, I will provide a high-level overview of how Origin Green works at the farm level in order to communicate and support farmers on sustainability improvement. Central to this is the Farm Sustainability Assurance Schemes. The Farm Sustainability Assurance Schemes are developed through stakeholder consultation with industry, farm organisations, and relevant government bodies. The schemes are built on best practice in farming, processing, current legislation, relevant industry guidelines, and international standards. And importantly, they're accredited to ISO 17065. At the farm level, there's over 55,000 members of Bord Bia sustainability assurance schemes for beef, lamb, dairy, horticulture, poultry, and eggs. And the infrastructure sees more than 100 auditors undertake over 650 farm audits each week. Every 18 months, Bord Bia auditors gather data across the audit process through the sustainability survey as part of the sustainable beef, lamb, and dairy assurance schemes. The data gathered is combined with data from other national farm databases to generate a farmer feedback report, which includes a summary of the farm carbon footprint performance under the following headings: general farm performance, carbon footprint, greenhouse gases, nutrient management, general grass management, and farm health and safety. The report data compares current farm performance against changes since the last 18-month audit and similar production systems in their area. The purpose of the report is to demonstrate to members how their farm inputs and activities contribute to GHG production, and will contain advice and feedback on how to mitigate against these emissions and improve production efficiencies. Next slide, please. And one more. Thank you. To provide guidance directly to farmers on additional sustainability areas, Bord Bia has an online learning hub to provide LMS courses on animal welfare, soil health, biodiversity, and much more. If you click once more, the modules have been developed with industry experts, including Teagasc, to simplify the actions that farmers can take to become more environmentally and economically sustainable. Next slide, please. Then finally, to end out the 3 minutes, to communicate the importance of sustainability to farmers directly, Bord Bia has a series of farmer communication and engagement activities ranging from farm walks, newsletter, direct communications, and agri-media partnerships. These communication activities detail to farmers the importance of sustainability to improve farm efficiency and the importance of sustainability credentials for international customers. Now, today I've presented a very top line of the Origin Green program without discussing retail level or the manufacturing level. But if you want to learn more about the programs and the insights garnered from the program, please visit origingreen.ie. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Martin, and thanks for keeping to the 3 minutes. And next up, we'll have Lucy Smith. Lucy is Senior Manager of Soft Commodities with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, WBCSD. Before joining WBCSD, Lucy worked for the World Wildlife Foundation in France for 5 years. And before that, she was the CSR manager at Jacquet Brossard. That's a leading French producer of industrial baked goods. Lucy, we'd love to hear from you now. And if you could just, I'm hearing an echo. Hopefully it's not on my end. If you could just tell us about the business perspective of sustainability, including what shareholders are asking of agri-food companies in terms of addressing sustainability and how companies are responding. Lucy, over to you.
Hello, thank you very much. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Fantastic. So hello, everyone. My name is Lucy Smith. As Shivani said, I manage the Soft Commodities Forum, which I can maybe just give a very brief overview of in order for everyone to be on the same page, and then try and unpack that question of the business perspective of sustainability as well as shareholder expectations for the agricultural commodity trading firm sector. So the Soft Commodities Forum is a sectoral platform which is embedded within the Scaling Positive Agriculture project of WBCSD, so the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. The Soft Commodities Forum is a collective working group which is comprised of 6 large agricultural commodity trading firms that you may know. There are 6 of them, so ADM, Bunge, Cargill, COFCO, Viterra, and Louis Dreyfus. So the very objective of this working group is to halt soy-driven deforestation and native vegetation conversion in the Brazilian Cerrado, which is a beautiful biome which is situated south of the Brazilian Amazon. So when I say SCF, that's the diminutive or the acronym for the soft commodities forum, just not to lose anyone. So the SCF has a very focused geographic scope because we focus our work on a set of 61 focus municipalities in the Brazilian Cerrado in order to define methodologies, standards, tools in order to combat deforestation and reverse its trend where the risk is highest. So you asked about, the business perspective of sustainability. I think it's a really interesting question, and I'll try and answer it as briefly as I can, and then I'll talk about shareholder expectations. So to answer your first point, I think that what's important to note is that some companies agree to work alongside each other in a pre-competitive manner, and that's the case of the Soft Commodities Forum. So I think that happens when companies recognize that an issue is material enough to forget about competitiveness and work side by side, even being fierce competitors, and that's the case of the Soft Commodities Forum. And I don't think that necessarily cancels the idea that sustainability can be a competitive advantage discussion, especially when it's represented in a set of business solutions, which is the case of each company which is a member of the Soft Commodities Forum. Nevertheless, that doesn't impinge the fact that they can get together, define common sustainability standards, and do so in accordance with antitrust regulation. So I just wanted to say that the pre-competitive nature of the working group and the implications that it has when looking at defining common metrics that each company can apply in order to disclose performance. And on your second issue with respect to shareholders and what they're looking out for, I think that it's in every shareholder's nature to look out for low risk, and in this case, low ESG risk. So of course, deforestation falls under the E of ESG, and ensuring that risk is managed, that ESG risk is managed, you need public disclosure of progress on key issues. And in the case of the soft commodities, issues that are linked to soy-driven deforestation, because all these companies source soy from the Brazilian Cerrado and then trade it on world markets. So the key tools that we'll have at our disposal are transparency and accountability tools. So it's really intrinsic to the work that the SCF does, defining KPIs that allow us to publish a biannual report in order to really make sure that we're being as transparent and as regular as possible in our frequency of disclosing progress, which of course is important information to investors as well as to downstream companies and another wider set of engaging stakeholders that we engage. Yeah.
Super. Thanks very much, Lucy. No, I'm sure we're going to have a lot of questions as well, touching back on this. But just to keep on time and to get us through the whole session, I'm going to turn now to Dave Maslin. Dave, hang on a second, where am I with my notes here? Dave is a general manager of markets and sustainability of New Zealand's Merino company. And he's responsible for the company's positioning and reputation with regards to ethics and sustainability. And he leads the work on, of course, sustainability, but also, interesting here, innovation and research programs. And that might actually touch back on what Lise Golden was talking about earlier. And manages international relationships with retail brand partners, supply chain partners, and industry organizations. This includes coordinating sales into all markets and managing B2B and B2C marketing activities. Dave engages with a diverse range of stakeholders, including luxury and fashion sectors, the outdoor industry, also NGOs, governments, and growers. Dave, welcome to this session. Really pleased to have you here. It's great to also have someone from the sort of, as I said, the non-food part of the agri chain. Can you tell us a bit about the key elements of New Zealand, the company's sustainability label, what this has meant for growers and for the business. Over to you, Dave. Thank you.
Thank you. Gosh, it sounds like I do a lot, doesn't it?
It does.
Kia ora tātou from down here in New Zealand. Really pleased to be able to talk to you today. So the New Zealand Merino Company is a wool business, a wool brand. We don't just sell wool out of New Zealand, we also sell wool out of New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, and from South America as well. I guess if we go to the next slide, I guess our core premise is what we describe as connecting the best growers in the world to the best brands in the world and ensuring the supply chain in between them operates effectively. And we do that in New Zealand in a slightly unique context globally, in that we operate in a non-subsidy environment here in New Zealand. So effectively, for our growers to compete on the commodity market, we need to be able to generate greater value from the products that we're transacting globally. And I guess around 20 years ago, when our business was formed, we had a group of growers who were slowly going out of business because they quite simply couldn't compete. They had no idea how much they're going to get paid from one season to the next, and whether or not the markets would actually want to purchase the fibre that they were producing. So they formed us as a business to take their product to the market. If we go to the next slide, please. The fundamental premise of how we did that was by taking an incredibly consumer-centric focus. So rather than starting on farm and then working methodically stage by stage through the value chain in a very linear fashion, we placed the end user or the consumer right at the center. And then we worked with each individual player within the supply chain, brands, and back to farm to, I guess, reverse engineer a product that a consumer was going to be more willing to purchase. And if we're developing something like that, if we're developing a product that a consumer is more willing to purchase, then a brand is going to be more likely to preferentially purchase our fibre. And so in doing that, we were able to, I guess, create an incentive for growers to change their farming systems to align to the values of the consumers that were purchasing their product. And it's worked extraordinarily well. If we go to the next slide, please. We now work with something in excess of 130 global brands. Some of them are relatively small, and some of them, as you can see just from this Précis slide here, are global players in the broader textile trade. I guess what this brings us to is, the role that sustainability plays in our ability to extract additional value. So if we go to the next slide, please. We've got brands now who, through consumer forces, are needing to give confidence around how the product has been produced. For example, this is an Allbirds shoe. They now label all of their products with the greenhouse gas footprint. They can do this in year one. If they don't drive that number down in year 2, year 3, and year 4, the consumers are going to ask why, and so they're investors. And so the onus then comes back onto us to try and provide them with tools to do that. If we go to the next slide, please. And the way we've done that has been through the development of what we call our regenerative index. In the center of this slide, you'll see ZQ. ZQ is non-farm accreditation standard. It's like a lot of on-farm standards. It's been running for 15 years. It covers environmental integrity, social responsibility, animal welfare, and so forth. And it sets a really high bar. I guess what we wanted to do was try to provide a tool that enabled us to capture all the things that growers do that go beyond minimum acceptable practice. There was a comment earlier on in the Q&A before this session about the need to be able to be highly customized to individual farm contexts and country contexts. This model allows us to do this. So we can map and benchmark a farm's performance against 15 key performance indicators around environment, animal welfare, and social and community responsibility. Not just benchmark where they are today, but actually monitor and quantify their cadence of change and progress over time. By doing that, we're doing something that our competitors can't do. That gives us competitive advantage to them, and we're able to extract greater value from our brands, and in so doing, drive that continual sustainable change over time. I'll end there because I think I'm on time.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dave. Fabulous. Really, really interesting. I'm very interested to hear more about this, competitive aspect, that value and that innovation to meet the really your consumer desires, and then, working it backwards from there. Right, to round up our session today, we're going to have and hear from Ronaldo Goto. Ronaldo is the Chief Compliance Officer at BRF from Brazil. I'm not sure if many of you know, but BRF is really one of the largest companies in Brazil. They are really the biggest exporter of poultry and pig products, and they're present in 117 countries, have something like 100,000 employees. Ronaldo, I'd just love to hear from you. What are some of the sustainability measures that BRF Global has implemented? What's involved in these? Why were they developed? And listen, the floor is yours. You have 3 minutes. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Shivani. It's good to see you. Good to see have a meeting with you and Annelise and Eli also in Paris. It was very kind for you. Yeah. So good evening, good afternoon, good morning for everyone. So as Shivani has already said, BRF is the largest poultry export in the world. Brazil is the largest exporter in the world because BRF is the largest poultry export in the world. We produce more than 4.6 million tons of foods in 2021. Yeah, out of our 38 industrial units here in Brazil, in other 6 countries. Yeah, and we have more than 300,000 customers all around the world, as Shivani also mentioned. Yeah. So sustainability is the broader concept applied to states and nations, but we are more focused on the responsible business conduct, and that's very well structured by OECD. Yeah, so sustainability is in the core of our business. 9% of the energy that we use comes from renewable source. 100% of the poultry from our integrated producers are from producing cage-free, and we also have 100% of water recovered to the market. Yeah. We do it because it's good? No, because it's also have a financial impact. All these measures also have a financial benefits for the company, and also brings also competitive advantages also for BRF. Yeah. These policies apply not only for BRF in Brazil. We also have plants outside of the country. So in Turkey, for example, we have 100% of the units certified with zero waste. And we also understand that the companies has a huge social responsibility and impact, and we have more than 5,000 immigrants and also refugees working here for us in Brazil. All in all, I think that we are going to discuss a little bit our journey regarding to sustainability. But as Shivani mentioned, yes, sustainability is also part of our strategy. So that's my first word.
Thank you very much, Ronaldo. I'm going to actually now turn to all of the speakers and ask each of you. First of all, thank you very much for these insights. I think this has really given us a lot of food for thought. But I wanted to understand a little bit more about any challenges that you've seen in terms of managing. How do you manage exporting to multiple countries? One of the things that we often see is that there's a diversity of sustainability standards out there. I'd like you to reflect a bit on that and tell us a bit, if you can, about some of your challenges, and if you're able to also, what do you think? We've got many policymakers in the audience here today, and we're here at the OECD. What are your thoughts, if you can, tell us what are your thoughts in terms of what governments can do to help in this regard? Shall we start that round? Martin, maybe would you like to take the floor, and if each of you could have let's say 2 minutes to reflect on this, that would be really helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, Shivani. And it's a very good question, and it's one that we deal with in Bord Bia. In Ireland, we export food and drink products to over 179 countries worldwide. So it's very important to understand what customers want in those markets. When we come to the area of sustainability, it means very different things to different markets around the world. We conduct sustainability research, global sustainability research in Bord Bia every 3 years to identify what are the sustainability trends across our key markets. What we see in the European market is quite different from what we see in the Middle East to what's different in Southeast Asia. And what we see in the EU is animal welfare, grass-fed is at the top of the agenda. What we see in the Middle East and Southeast Asia, of course, is food safety. And that changes across different product categories. So PCF isn't the same as dairy or beef. Lamb isn't the same as poultry. So consumers and customers want very different things across the agendas. What they want, customers, is something that's tangible, something that they understand. So something like packaging, something like health claims is what sustainability means to them. Yet we're dealing with big challenges around biodiversity and around emissions and around water quality, but those aren't messages that seem to resonate with consumers at the moment. So for ourselves, it's understanding how can we develop messages with our food products to show that we are doing work in these areas and that it is of importance for customers. So later this year, we are conducting global emissions research to understand what is the best messaging we can put on products to show how actions that farmers or producers are making is leading to reduced emissions. So it's kind of bringing the consumers and our customers from those kind of simple tangible claims around natural grass-fed packaging to more heavier claims around biodiversity and CO2, because they're not at the top of the agenda when they're making that price purchase.
Super interesting. I wasn't really expecting you to say that, but that's really a really good call. I definitely understand the differences in the different regions, but very interesting. And I'm pretty sure Dave will have something to say to that, because it sounds from what he had said to us that they are actually targeting that. But before I go to Dave, I was going to give Lucy a chance to reflect on this. What are you seeing in terms of some of the challenges and sort of that you see in your membership in exporting to different or trading with different countries around the world? What are you hearing, Lucy? Thanks.
Thank you. I think that what's clear is that the expectations from demand side countries for soy, which mainly goes to the feed industry, are shaping up through regulation. So that's clearly visible in the UK with the due diligence law, as well as in the EU, as well as in the United States with the Forest Act. So Western markets are basically developing regulation on the topic of combating imported deforestation onto their markets. And so I'd say that one of the biggest challenges for the soy trading sector has to do with making sure that the requirements and implications of those regulations are still operational enough for the companies to be able to export with lower costs and operational efficiency, which is one of the big standing points from the agricultural commodity trading sector when looking at these regulations shaping up. So that's the first point I wanted to make. And then the second has to do with the need for alignment and the need for recognition of sustainability standards that are voluntary and developed by the companies themselves with producers, as well as with downstream players, such as the Consumer Goods Forum, as well as other platforms, which collectively represent downstream firms, which are exposed to higher risk of deforestation in terms of reputational risk.
Great. No, thank you for that. And I think that certainly at the OECD, that's some of the challenges we are seeing as well. And that's one of the areas that we're trying to promote is this coherence, cross recognition in ways in which we can actually promote a lot more alignment across at least our membership, and if not more, even globally, I would say. Good. So continuing, I'd love to hear from Dave. What are your thoughts in terms of what are some of the biggest challenges, and how are you seeing this? And again, you've got the floor to if you wanted to ask for governments, make an ask to governments. What would you ask? You have the floor, Dave. Thanks.
Thank you. It's interesting because the opposite side of a challenge is an opportunity, and that's the way we tend to look at a lot of this. I guess if we have a look at the standards that are out there, there's three kinds. There's private standards, private programs like what we have, which is owned by us. there's standards that are driven by non-government organizations, and they'll be tending to be around specific interest areas. And then there's government minimum standards. And for us, we tend to operate in the former two, because everything we're trying to do is about driving a point of difference that's going to enable a brand to differentiate themselves. Because if we're doing that, then we're driving value back to our growers, and our growers are able to derive greater returns for the products that they're producing. So I guess how and what the opportunity, where the opportunities might be for government to work in there, or where the I guess where the challenges are for us. There's a huge challenge around methodology alignment. The earlier comments around one size fits all with regard to sustainability, and I guess the colossal issues that or unintended consequences that can have. We see that every single day. I guess the acknowledgement that farm systems are all different. I mean, even in New Zealand, farms side by side are going to have vastly different challenges that they're trying to address. And so for us, what we are trying to do is to establish what we call a meta brand that satisfies all of those kind of legislative requirements, NGO requirements, but then actually goes beyond that. So we're sort of satisfying all of those minimum pieces, but then take a very nuanced approach to measure the outcomes that are occurring as a result of specific on-farm interventions that are occurring, and providing support through to our growers to enable them to model what their impacts might be on their farm. So where governments can really support that is through that provision of support and investment in R&D to drive positive practice change. It's acknowledgement that there are private standards and schemes out there that are doing a really good job, that are driving the sorts of outcomes that we need, and acknowledging those. And it's alignment of those core methodologies, particularly around some of the big indicator type schemes like LCA, for example. I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole right now, but some huge challenges there. So that'd be the three from my perspective.
Very interesting and very concrete ask. Absolutely, alignment on the methodologies, and then potentially this acknowledging of schemes that actually are working. Interesting. Good. I'm going to end up. Ronaldo, what are your thoughts? You've got a portfolio that exports to over 100 countries. What do you see as some of the biggest challenges? And if you could ask from governments for help, what would you like to see? And it's interesting. This is picking up from an earlier comment in the first session on, from an emerging markets perspective. So I would be interested to hear your point of view. Ronaldo, you have the floor.
Yes, I agree very much with Dave's and Marta's concerns about priorities. You can see that different countries have different priorities that already impacts in the NGO and also the rating institution priorities. This type of coherence is quite challenging, I would say, yeah. And the concept that was also previously discussed about science-based indicators is also a quite challenging topic to be mentioned. Yeah. I would point out 5 areas where you can see this type of distinguish the way of seeing the priorities. I mean, energy production or renewable energy is a field that here in Latin America we have a very let's say good matrix in terms of renewable energy. That's not a top priority at least in our risk assessment. Yeah. But food traceability, or mainly grain traceability, and we have a very similar initiative as Lucy was explaining. Although we do not produce grains, we are the largest grain consumer in Brazil, and therefore we follow all the due diligence concepts promoted by OECD, also to guarantee that during our entire value chain we also have the good standards. And labor conditions is also have very different perspective. They are according to different legislation, and also to different markets where we work. And also gender equality is also a topic that has very different dimensions according to the market. And so all in all, to fulfill and also to tackle all these different aspects for different markets always costs also sometimes for us not only to answer the questionnaires, yeah, but also to adapt our policies to all these different global standards.
Great. Thank you very much, Ronaldo. We're going to turn it now over to all of you in the audience to ask your questions of the panelists. If you could just maybe introduce yourself and just explain if you have a question targeted to one of the panelists, that would be helpful. You can also put it in the chat, or again, just raise your hand, or your virtual hand, or your real hand, as you like. So I'm going to just open the floor and just see if there's anyone who has any questions. We have a fair bit of time for questions, so the floor is now yours as an audience. I see we have someone from the FAO, Marlo. And yes, why don't we start first with Marlo? I saw your hand up first, and then we'll go to Kieran from Australia.
Thanks, Shivani, and thanks very much to the panelists. It's been a really exciting and interesting session to sort of hear from all of you. I have two questions, one for Martin and one for Lucy, but in the interest of time, I'll target my question to Martin, and maybe we can come back to Lucy later. I was really interested, Martin, to sort of hear the extent to which work was done in the Origin Green sort of approach to align with existing industry standards, third-party certification schemes. And I think the work, sorry, I didn't introduce myself. I'm a senior agribusiness researcher at FAO. I also work with Tomislav in the Responsible Global Value Chains team, and I work very specifically on tropical fruit, on the sustainability side of tropical fruit export and trade. And so my interest was really in how do you develop this buy-in in another approach. I think, you know, the companies that we talk to constantly report on audit fatigue and the challenges that they face with increasing reporting all the time. And so my question to you, Martin, is sort of not only how do you manage that sort of buy-in from farmers, but I was also interested to find out if your approach extended throughout the value chain. And at the end of your presentation, you did say that it does. So I'd be very interested to hear a little bit more about how you initially get that buy-in in the upstream, and then how do you go beyond that to extend that all the way to the retailer end? Thank you. I'll stop there. Thanks, Shivani.
And maybe before we turn to you, Martin, just to give you some time to reflect on that, maybe we can get Kieran, your question as well, and who you'd like to direct it to.
Thanks, Shivani. The question's really for anyone, but I'll probably more focus it towards Dave if I could, just for simplicity. And thanks for everyone's presentations. It was really fascinating. Sorry, Dave, you probably answered a few of these questions. So I'm going to ask you to drill a little bit more. In particular, I was interested in whether you thought your industries and your producers' closeness to the market and consumers was a key reason why change did happen. I'd be interested in that. And also be interested to know whether what support or direction you got from government to make this change, and whether in the hindsight of things, you think this was actually a good investment by the industry to invest in these changes. Thank you.
Thanks, Kieran. So Martin, we're going to hear from you first of all. If you could have to take the floor, please.
Perfect. Thanks very much. So when we look at the quality assurance schemes that Borbia has developed at the farm levels, these actually preceded or came before the Origin Green program. So they've been in place for about over 30 years, and they've gradually developed over time. The 80 to 150 page modules full of criteria have grown over the years. And when they first came about, that was primarily looking at addressing food safety and regulatory measures. As customers' concerns around additional raw material sourcing came about, additional measures were added. Those additional measures were added in consultation with the different farm bodies, with government agencies, and with other NGO groups. So before every quality assurance scheme is redeveloped and updates on a 3 to 5 year basis, we have what we call a technical advisory committee who meets to revise all of those additional criteria. So we have representatives from farmer organizations, industry, and government bodies sitting around that table working together. Now, the criteria are put forward and they are robustly discussed, and each line and wording of them goes back and forwards between all the different members around the table. So it can take a number of months to arrive on the point of agreement, but it is very much a stakeholder collaborative process where you have industry, the farmer organizations, and the government agencies all giving their recommendations. And not until all parties are satisfied with those recommendations does the update to the scheme come about. So it is very much a collaborative process to how the schemes have developed over the last 20 to 25 years. When we look further down the supply chain, and this is a key component of the Origin Green program, at the company and at the manufacturing, retail and food service level, companies are asked to develop multi-annual sustainability plans. These typically range of 5 years duration. Within those plans, they have to detail between 4 to 8 different sustainability targets, and they are robust sustainability targets. So over the 5 years, they must have different initiatives to how they're going to reach their different targets. And then each year, their plans are independently reviewed by an external agencies. So their plans can range from 40 pages, some are all the way up to 200 pages. And each year they must provide a submission to show what actions they've done over the past 12 months and provide quantitative KPIs to show how energy has been reduced, whether that's through energy bills, or we'll do an on-site audit of the company to make sure everything's in line. Key to this is environmental legislation, which underpins the sustainability plan. So if a company fails environmental legislation or does not meet the targets, they will be removed from the program. And we do this every year. I think about 50 companies were removed last year, but then over 90% of them do come back on board because they see the relevancy of having those sustainability credentials. And because of Origin Green to key international customers, it is seen as something that Irish companies need if they want to transact in business with them going forward.
Super, thank you very much, Martin. I'm going to now turn it over to Dave, if you could help us out with answering the question from Australia a little earlier.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Karen. It's a really good one. I think the short answer is absolutely yes. The closeness of our growers to the market and the market to our growers is fundamental in our model. And you know, I'm actually heading over to Australia next week, specifically to sit down with growers over there and the presidents of some of the brands that we're working with to talk through some of the challenges that the brands are having and equally that the growers are having, and together we can then work to solutions. A really good example of that working in action is there was an animal welfare practice that raised the ire of many of the NGOs in Australia and New Zealand and globally. In fact, it raised its head in about 2005. We worked with our brands to find out how big an issue it was going to be. The brand said, total deal breaker for us. We will need to move away from wool unless we can address this. We went back to our growers and said, right, well, here's the issue. We need you to phase this practice out. And they said, well, we can't, it's going to cost us a lot of money and so forth. What we did, we partnered with the government to undertake quite a considerable R&D program to identify strategies where growers could stop applying this practice with minimal risk and apply it on their farms. And in concert with that, we worked with our brands to establish long-term forward contracts that would guarantee they'd purchase the wool at a fair and reasonable price, provided they phased that practice out. Within 3 years, a practice that was applied by around about 50% of our suppliers, within 3 years that practice was phased out. It took another, I believe, 7 years from that date before the government could actually enact legislation to ban it. And when they did, it passed with barely a whisper because it was a non-event in New Zealand anymore. So the speed of that change was 100% driven by pull from the market, but enabled through strategic investment by private and government working together on a very, very targeted R&D and extension program. So hopefully that answers that both of your questions around what support the government can provide in one.
No, it's a really great example because it also shows, I mean, that the need to actually that collaboration and actual partnership, but also that staging of it, right? I mean, it didn't all just happen in a very quick way, but it is possible. Would love to read up on that. Presumably you have a case study or something written up you could share with us, and that would be really appreciated. But okay, let's continue with the questions. I see that we have Lucia, very good, from Spain, who's got her hand up, and invite you to take the floor, Lucia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shivani. It would be a very, very short question. But before, I mean, thank you very much for all the speakers. I think it's always very important to know experience, specific ones, and so on. But I just wanted to ask Martin if the differences between Origin Green and the organic product certification. And after this short question, if there's time, and if not, I can understand it, maybe a general reflection from the other speakers, if they want, about if we have too many or maybe not different certifications in relation with sustainability. But because at the very beginning, this was the organic one only, but now we have a lot of, and now that they are getting also welfare certifications, and so if they think that this can give confusion to consumers or not, from their point of view, how can we avoid this confusion or not? Thank you very much.
Thank you for that question. It's a question that we increasingly are asked over the last probably 12 to 6 months. Organic, there's quite a number of farmers within the Origin Green program that are organic farmers. However, organic certification is separate to the Origin Green program. So if you seek to get organic certification, you must apply to another organic certification scheme. At the moment, there isn't cross-relevancy between the two programs.
Great, thank you, Martin. I'm just looking at time, and I think that's a nice closing question potentially that we could just turn to all of the speakers to think through what Lucia actually raised. It just seems that there's a lot of different, requests, expectations, even just different certifications that are out there. Are there too many? Are there too few? Or do we need to have as many as we do? Partly we are dealing with different issues. Are there ways that you think we could help actually reduce the confusion? Some ideas that you've seen work in the past that you'd like to see if it's not happening at the moment. Maybe Lucy, if I could start with you, if that's all right. Just your reflections on this. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I mean, I think it's a really good question. I think that no matter the product or the industry that we look at, there's a multiplication of certification schemes, and that can definitely create confusion. I'll speak on behalf of the Soft Commodities Forum, which again, has agricultural trading firms that are operating in a B2B market. So the confusion isn't necessarily held by the consumer because the companies don't sell directly to consumers. Nevertheless, when trying to think of solutions which can help hinder the multiplication of certification schemes, I think that at the SCF, at least, what we're trying to do is really work towards that interoperability between different links across the value chain in order for solutions to be developed at scale and recognized across the value chain versus having a portfolio of products which is divided according to very specific certification schemes, but which doesn't necessarily solve the problem. So i.e. in the case of the Soft Commodities Forum, deforestation and native vegetation conversion at a scale, right? So what we're trying to do is really look at all of the soy that's exported from a set of municipalities within the Brazilian Cerrado and consider all that soy as zero deforestation, zero conversion, versus asking the companies to either develop a new certification scheme in their own name or correspond to other criteria which would correspond to other certification schemes. So I think that the logic is a bit different, but it's an important one in order to systemically transform food systems globally.
Thank you, Lucy. No, I think it's very, very, very timely to think through about the scale aspect and the speed at which we need to have this change happen. I'm going to turn now maybe to Ronaldo, if you have some closing thoughts on, too many certifications, what can be done to help, streamline that. And maybe if you just keep it to really short, and then we can end up with Dave and then Martin to finalize. Yeah.
So short answer to Lucia's questions is yes. Yeah, the impression is that we have a lot of claims and certifications. But it also brings another discussions because at the end of the day, part of this industry of claims and also certifications comes to add value also to the product, because you pay a little bit more if it's organic, you pay a little bit more if you do not use genetically modified items. Yeah, you pay a little bit more if it's greener, I would say. Yeah. So another discussion that is important to bring to the table is the lobbying also for this type of green, and the fair price for the products related to that. Yeah, I think that it's fair to say that everyone is much more concerned about the traceability of the food. That's a very important issue that needs to be tackled. Yeah, but we need to observe also these two different aspects, that the increasing number of claims and the increasing number of certifications also could bring another concerns about lobbying and also the fair price of the products.
Thanks, Ronaldo. Dave?
It's a really interesting question. We call it the certification soup, because there's hundreds and hundreds of them out there, and they mean different things to different people, and it's really challenging. That said, what's the answer to that? Do we try and standardize the standards? For us, that's not going to drive the sort of change that the planet needs, because at the moment we're able to drive change by being distinct, because by being distinct we're able to extract greater value. We're able to position ourselves to achieve greater value for our growers, and therefore we're able to incentivize them to make change. So if everybody's on exactly the same platform, distinction's gone, point of difference is gone, therefore the ability to extract value is reduced. So I guess what that's prompted us to do, because kind of a standardization is inevitable, is saying, well, what goes beyond certification? How do we move beyond just straight compliance, right? So we establish a minimum bottom line, but how can we actually start measuring the outcomes that are associated with specific interventions or incentives? And that's, I guess, what we're trying to do with the RX index, where if a brand wants to make particular impact around climate, they will partner with and incentivize growers who go above and beyond compliance, specifically around how they're minimizing or mitigating their greenhouse gas impact, provided we've got a tool to be able to quantify that. It's really hard to put a set of rules around it, because every farm's ability to react is going to be different, but measuring impact and measuring outcomes is one way of remaining distinct while still, I guess, standardizing methodology. I'm not sure if I've answered the question or not, but it's slightly counter to one or two of the other comments so far.
No, great. It's great response. I'm going to ask Martin if just keep it to 30 seconds. I realize we're a little bit over time, and I'm eating into your everybody's break, so that's not a good thing. But Martin, maybe in 30 seconds, you could.
Ultimately, certifications are here to stay. Every different country has different types of certifications. There's multiple different animal welfare certifications across Europe, because food production is cultural. People purchase foods, they have a different way of thinking upon different cultures. So animal welfare in particular means something different across different regions. And if you want to access those markets, you have to apply to those schemes to get that consumer and get that customer relevance.
Terrific. No, thank you. I just want to say thanks again. We really come up to the end of the time. In fact, more have gone over our time. So apologies to all of you for that. Listen, this has been a really terrific panel. I encourage you all to hopefully, stay in touch. I think there's a lot that could be continued on these discussions. I understand now that we're going to take a 10-minute break. We'll start again, just checking with TAD colleagues at 2 o'clock sharp. Is that right?
Yeah,
for
that'd be
the
great.
third session?
Yes,
Okay, thanks,
please.
Ellie. So you've got about 7 minutes, I think, of a break. And I believe I'm going to then be turning it over to Jared Greenville, who will be moderating, who's Executive Director of Aberis, but I believe Jared used to work at the OECD, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, thought as much. And hi, Jared. And he'll be taking us through the final session of the workshop today at 2 p.m. All right, great. Well, thanks everyone, and see you all in a couple more minutes. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Shivani. Please don't exit the Zoom. Just turn off your cameras and we'll see you back here shortly. Thank you.
Excellent. We might start again. Hello, everyone.
This meeting is being recorded.
Record go. Welcome back to the third session of today's seminar. It's been really interesting so far. So As Shivani mentioned, my name is Jared Greenville, and I'm now the Executive Director of ABARES, which is the Agricultural Research Bureau of the Australian Government. I'm very happy to be here. I'm joining you from Canberra, where it's pretty late on Ngunnawal country, who are the traditional owners of the land in which I live. We've got a great session ahead of us. I believe that we're going to start, like we started at the very start of the day, with a short poll to get people's views as we kind of lean into this session. And I think it's going to pop up, but the poll's going to take a look at, in your view, what are some of the measures that are going to be most effective in achieving sustainability in agriculture production for imports? So there's a whole list of different things up there, and it would be interesting to see where the results come. But as people spend some time musing over which button to select on that, in this session, I'll just give you a bit of a brief rundown. We're going to explore the role that trade plays in sustainability, and this has come up a few times in the discussions that we've already had. We know that there's, trade plays a key role in ensuring that we produce enough food to feed the world's population, and it's likely to play an increasingly important role as we have climate starting to shift, and place pressures on our global production systems, and ensuring that we can continue to produce the food that we need as we go forward. But as we've already touched on, what are some of the issues here in this space, and how does trade then influence those in time delivering sustainable outcomes in agriculture? We've got three very distinguished speakers who are going to talk us through some of the issues in this space, and so I'm really interested to hear where we will go. What I'll do is I'll start with the introduction, and then we'll go to each speaker. We'll get the results, I think, of that poll as it will come through, and that will be an interesting just to see where people's minds are set, and that might help the speakers as they go along. But to start with, as following the agenda, we'll have Alan Matthews, who I'm sure most of you will know or read certainly his work. Alan's a Professor Emeritus of European Agriculture Policy at Trinity College in Dublin. He's an agricultural economist with a keen interest and a long history in analysing EU agriculture policy, ag trade policy, climate change policy, and has worked for almost all international organisations, the European Commission, European Parliament, and participated at the WTO extensively. Recently, Alan completed a report on the external dimensions of the EU's Green Deal for agri-food trade, where he looked at trade policy interventions and particularly unilateral measures such as mirror clauses, and he's also written a report for the Environment Directorate here at the OECD entitled Identifying and Assessing Subsidies and Other Incentives Harmful to Biodiversity at the National Level, a comparative review of existing national assessment and insights for good practice, which apparently will be declassified soon. So I'm looking forward to seeing that. As we can see here, just to get where people's views are at, we see that there's, I guess, a strong view towards multilateral agreements on sustainability standards, mandatory due diligence requirements and sustainable supply chains. So there's a few different views, but a scattering across all the different categories that we have up on the questions. To kick us off today, I'd like to ask Alan his views about trade policy and trade measures that can deliver sustainable production at both the local and the global level. So I'll hand over to you, Alan.
Thank you very much, Jared, and also to OECD for the invitation to take part in what has been a really interesting workshop so far. I want to stress that the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development recognizes international trade as an engine for inclusive economic growth and poverty reduction, and an important means to achieve the SDGs. But trade can also have a negative impact on other SDGs when, for example, imports are associated with human rights abuses, such as land grabbing, forced labor, child labor, or gender exploitation. Imports can also be associated with environmental costs. If, for example, imports of beef or soya give an incentive to tropical deforestation, or imports of palm oil encourage an expansion of production onto carbon-rich soils. Relevant sustainability standards for food cover health, climate, environment, social, and animal welfare impacts. Importantly, they relate to production practices, the way a product is produced, rather than product characteristics. And there are various international conventions that exist to seek to establish minimum sustainability standards for products entering international trade. But in light of the global health, climate, and environmental challenges, many countries have accepted the need to act to bring about a faster transition to more sustainable food systems, most recently at the UN Food Systems Summit last year. And this brings an additional dynamic into play, as countries have different starting points and are moving at different speeds, we heard in the last session. Countries that introduce higher standards are at risk of raising costs for their farmers and thus causing a loss of competitiveness. Whether this is the case or not, of course, is ultimately an empirical matter. We heard some examples of how the market can react and in fact value some of the additional sustainability characteristics of products. But to the extent that there is a loss of competitiveness arising from the introduction of higher sustainability standards, a political economy reaction is triggered from producers who now face increased competition from imported products that are produced to lower standards. This leads producers to demand a level playing field by requiring that imported products should meet the same production standards as they must meet. And in this, they're often supported by consumer groups and environmental NGOs, again, that came through very strongly in the last session, who point out that otherwise, and assuming that demand remains unchanged, domestic production will be replaced by imports, and the environmental consequences of that production will simply be exported abroad. In the case of climate policy, for example, this is referred to as carbon leakage. Indeed, producers make the argument that unless trade policy measures such as higher import standards are introduced, higher sustainability standards domestically may worsen the global situation, for example, by increasing global emissions or by increasing the global quantum of animal suffering if sustainability or animal welfare standards are significantly lower in the countries where the substitute production takes place. Another motivation for trade policy measures that impose sustainability standards on imports is that market access can be used, especially by larger countries, as a lever to try to raise global sustainability standards. By making access to its market contingent on meeting these higher standards, an importing country can try to influence other countries to also raise their standards. Indeed, as an exporting country will often decide to pitch its standards at the level of its most demanding export market, there is the potential for the impact of such import standards to be amplified and to also influence standards for production to other markets. The use of trade policy measures such as import standards is governed by international trade law, notably the WTO agreements on sanitary and phytosanitary standards, on technical barriers to trade, as well as the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. WTO rules do not prevent a country from setting the health and environmental standards that it deems desirable on its own territory, subject to meeting certain conditions, but jurisprudence is more contested when it comes to import standards that have the intent to raise health, animal welfare, or environmental standards in third countries. Now, I'm not a trade lawyer, so I'm not going to pronounce on the WTO consistency of import sustainability standards, but let's look instead at the practicalities of when and how such standards might be implemented. The trade policy measures available to ensure greater coherence between trade policy and the objective of a more sustainable agri-food system include multilateral, bilateral, and unilateral measures. Multilateral measures refer to raising international standards in bodies such as the Codex Alimentarius Commission or the World Organization for Animal Health, or negotiating multilateral environment agreements such as the Paris Agreement or the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants. Multilateral agreements that set high minimum standards and have a credible enforcement mechanism are the gold standard in terms of ensuring coherence between trade policy and sustainability objectives. And I think our poll maybe reflects that. They both raise global standards, avoid the risk that imports lead to unwanted environmental pressures in exporting countries, and ensure a level playing field. The problem with international agreements is that they tend to the lowest common denominator. Few have a credible enforcement mechanism. Many rely principally on peer pressure. If a country wishes to introduce domestic standards that go beyond those agreed at the international level, then other measures will be necessary to achieve the desired objectives. Bilateral measures can include introducing sustainability clauses in free trade agreements or supporting the transition to more sustainable practices in third countries through financial or technical assistance. They rely on voluntary agreements between two parties. Exporting countries might accept to enforce higher standards on exports in return for greater preferential access to the importing country market or greater flows of financial assistance. Unilateral measures include mandatory due diligence legislation requiring firms to ensure that they have clean supply chains, the use of mirror or reciprocity clauses where specific requirements are set out in a country's customs code and shipments are checked for compliance at the border, or the introduction of sustainability labeling. Of the different kinds of sustainability measures, mirror clauses are probably the most far-reaching in their effect. An example of a mirror clause is the recently enacted but not yet enforced EU legislation to prohibit the import of meat where antibiotics have been used as a growth promoter, or where antibiotics that are particularly critical for human use have been used in animal production. Restrictions that also apply, of course, to EU producers. Although all countries have signed up to the need to combat antimicrobial resistance, not all countries are yet prepared to go as far as the EU in restricting the use of antibiotics in animal husbandry, often perhaps because of the political power of their domestic animal production industry. These various measures will differ in their effectiveness in raising global environmental standards, in providing a level playing field, and in lowering the external footprint of production and consumption. The decision how to raise the sustainability standards of imports requires a case-by-case impact assessment, as well as extensive discussion with trading partners, particularly developing countries, prior to implementation. These discussions will not be easy. Sustainability standards will increase frictions in international trade. Countries put different weights on the different dimensions of sustainability, whether economic, social, or environmental. It can be complicated to account for the fact that not all countries have contributed equally to the decline and deterioration of global environmental goods. Yet despite these reservations, it is important to ensure that trade policy is coherent with and supportive of the global transition to more sustainable food systems. So thanks, Jared, and I look forward to any questions in the discussion.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Alan. That's some very interesting points that you raise, and a whole raft of different issues I think that people would love to start to ask questions about. What we're going to do, I should have mentioned at the start, is that we'll hold questions till the end, and then we'll go through and either raise your hand or pop a question in the chat, and we can direct from there. In the meantime, we might carry on with our speakers and go through the three interventions. So just to move on, the second speaker we have now, and we'll hear from Valeria Pinheiro. Dr. Valeria Pinheiro is a senior research coordinator in the Markets, Trade and Institutions Division of IFPRI. Her work includes modelling on the impacts of agricultural support policies on emissions from agriculture, and also reviewing the evidence on incentives for the adoption of sustainable agricultural practices and their outcomes. She has quite significant experience working in the areas of economic development and growth, using CGE analysis and other analytical tools, and has for the last several years led courses in many countries teaching theory and application related to CGE models. Valeria has recently published a paper, Can Trade Contribute to Global Environmental Sustainability? So it's key to where we're going today. So thank you very much again for coming along, Valeria. Can I get you to share with us a bit of detail and some thoughts around trade impacts on developing countries and of standards, of developed country standards, and with some examples as you go along?
So thank you very much, Jared, for the introduction, and thank you very much, the OECD for inviting me here today to share some of the work we've been doing at IFPRI. So I think that my presentation will really give us the almost like the narrative of everything that it was talked about in the first part of this event, or the first panel, and it will really end up with actually the second panel, the discussion that it was from the second panel. There are some things that also Alan just mentioned, so I will just try to skip to those. But so the narrative here is that the challenge, it is really to produce a diversified basket of nutritious food in sufficient quantity, but also while reducing greenhouse gas emissions and minimizing the impact on natural resources. So accomplishing these diverse goals requires an integrated strategy. Yes, that takes into account increased productivity and the environmental sustainability of food production systems with a focus on efficient use of land, water, fertilizers, and energy, of course. Trade actually offers an effective solution to this challenge, since the endowment of natural resources available for sustainable food production presents large imbalances in regions, in global imbalances. Next slide, please. However, there is one concept that needs to be included at the time of analyzing sustainable production and diets and their promotion as well. And it is the inclusion of externalities that are generated by food systems. So the true cost of food that includes the pollution of water and air, greenhouse gas emissions, overgrown aquifers, biodiversity loss, antibiotic resistance that we just mentioned, land degradation, and the rise of health illnesses related also to food consumption. Next slide, please. So given these externalities, it is really necessary to find the right incentives, both in the short, but also in the long term. So from a scoping review of more than 18,000 articles, one of the things that we found was that incentives that make the adoption of sustainable practices attractive depend heavily on the enabling economic and financial environment, but also should account for trade-offs between economic and environmental outcomes. Next slide, please. So the policy environment around a food system has a large influence on the nexus between trade, climate change, production, and nutrition through 4 drivers. So how much we produce, what we produce, how we produce, and where it is produced. So agricultural trade in particular allows the world to take advantage of countries' heterogeneity differences in endowments. And we mean land, water, sun, and also the technology that will translate into different supply potential, food prices, and environmental footprints. By allowing countries to take advantage of their different endowments, with land-abundant countries providing exports and land-poor countries taking advantage of much more efficiently produced imports, which in the aggregate can be beneficial to the environment, especially under the right institutional framework. And this is where it was discussed previously. Also, by importing products and services from countries with abundant water resources, water deficient countries can alleviate the pressure on their own water supply. So to analyze the impact on trade on resource use and pollution, growing literature expresses trade flows in terms of the resource inputs and emissions content they carry. So this calls about the virtual carbon, land, water footprint. So the figure in this slide, what it shows is the water and fertilizer content embedded in international trade. And this is just an illustration that it covers China and the United States from the exports as well as the import sides. So what we're looking is at the water content on primary crops. China does not export a considerable amount, for example. However, it does save 200 billion cubic meters of water by importing commodities and 150 billion cubic meters of water in its agricultural imports. So the story is very different in the United States, having a higher use of water in its exports compared to these agricultural imports. And then the other graph shows the fertilizer, which it shows more or less the same trends. Next slide, please. So regarding the food access and availability, global markets have grown at a higher speed than domestic production to address the rising gaps between local demand and supply. So beyond the calories, the figure on the left shows that the net imports and food consumption of proteins, highlighting the fact that for some countries, trade becomes crucial, not only for the quantity of food needed for domestic consumption, but also for the access and availability of proteins and nutrients in their diets. And then the figure on the right, what it shows is the number of food groups with insufficient local production to achieve a healthy diet by country, adjusted by food loss and waste also. So the countries in the darker red represent a higher number of food groups with insufficient local production to achieve a healthy diet. So for example, Argentina has a low level of insufficiency, while Madagascar has not. So with this, what I want to say is that food trade, with the implementation of the right local policies to properly address natural resource management, is an efficient way to give greater sustainability to global food production. And a fair and transparent international food trading system not only has the potential to ensure global food security, but can also reduce the environmental impact of global food systems. And this is what actually Alan just mentioned. So the scope of trade agreements is also evolving to include environmental provisions. So between 1997 and 2019, out of the 318 agreements that were concluded, 131 included at least one environmental related provision, and 71 of the agreements incorporated provisions that display the interaction between the environment and agriculture. Such agreements provide incentives to producers to adopt sustainable practices to gain and maintain access to markets. But then the other incentive is public and private environmental standards that it was really well covered in the second panel of this event. And I just want to mention one thing that also Alan mentioned, but as a general clause, the WTO members are free to adopt environmental policies, such as environmental requirements and taxes at the level they choose, even if they significantly restrict trade, as long as they don't introduce unjustifiable and arbitrary discrimination or disguise protectionism as an excuse to protect domestic producers. And this is the only thing I just wanted to add to what Alan had just mentioned. And then just a little, to put it in kind of numbers, in developed countries, there are greater prospects for expanding sustainable consumption, either due to the environmental awareness or stricter environmental regulations related to the national determined contribution and zero emissions targets in the Paris Agreement. However, in low and middle income countries, the biggest barriers are higher costs and also a lack of legal requirements and policies on sustainable issues. So just to give some idea of size, in the ITC standards map, the number of voluntary sustainability standards has continued to grow. Currently, there are 321 active worldwide and about 455 eco-labels, according to Ecolabel Index, in 199 countries and 25 industry sectors. Specifically in the universe of agriculture, the ITC covers 160 standards. Next slide. And this is just an example to illustrate what happened in the southern cone of Latin America. And so it just shows 6 programs implemented in Colombia, Argentina, Brazil, and Chile for coffee, beef, cotton, and you can see there are many other commodities there. And so the implementation of these type of standards at the regional level has allowed these food suppliers to position themselves with an added environmental value in different markets. And so it has given them, allowed them as a management tool to make the production process more efficient and also associated with some benefits, both commercially and financially. And this is going to the incentives part. And just to conclude, trade, environmental standards, and better practices and technology can definitely contribute to achieving productivity increases and total food availability. And just to mention a couple of things on standards, so there's, as it was already mentioned, there's a multiplicity of sustainability standards that respond to different impact categories, scopes, different kind of chains and certification schemes. This really generates an additional implementation efforts and cost for the producers. So sometimes it is, it really hurts the smaller producers if it is not really well run and with the right incentives. So this is, I'm just going to mention 3 ideas that we are actually writing a policy brief for the T20 that it is done actually today was the meeting. And so the 3 things I just wanted to finish with is that ensuring that any private standard development has to be aligned with WTO standards. This is to ensure the principle of transparency, openness, and impartiality and consensus, effectiveness and relevance, coherence, as well as the concerns of developing or least developed countries to adhere when developing these private standards. So moreover, the restrictive measures are the challenging issues faced in accessing other countries' market. It's necessary to carry out a transparency exercise to monitor its adoption, and it was already mentioned today, work on the harmonization of them, and to ensure that they are based on science. And then the last thing is this can help advance in developing homogeneous methodologies to avoid the extra cost of opting for several certifications. Thank you very much, Jared, and sorry that I was a little bit over time. Thanks.
Thanks, Valeria, and no problem at all. Some really interesting points there, and thank you for your presentation. I think we're doing still okay on time, so I think we're all running smoothly. So that lends us to our third and final speaker for this session before we can jump into some questions. So finally, we're joined by Tom Hurtle as our last speaker. So Tom will be known to, I suspect, everyone as well. He's a distinguished professor of agricultural economics at Purdue University, where his research and teaching focus has been on international trade, food and environment security. He's a fellow and a past president of the Agricultural Applied Economics Association, and he's also a founder and executive director of the Global Trade Analysis Project, the GTAP project. Tom also leads GlassNet, the global to local analysis of systems sustainability, a university-wide and interdisciplinary project aimed at understanding global drivers of local sustainability challenges. And I think Tom's going to talk to us about some of this research today. Tom's most recent research is focused on food and environmental security and the impacts of climate change and mitigation policies on global sustainability, on trade and on land use and poverty. Tom, can I bring you in here and with your expertise across a range of fronts, and particularly taking into account, some of the spillovers and adjustments that occur in global markets when you change trade policy. Can you talk us through some of the spillovers from both global and local drivers of sustainability with some examples to illustrate?
Okay, how's that sound? Thank you, Jared.
Yep,
thanks for the intro. Thanks to the OECD for the invitation to speak here. I'm excited to share with you my thoughts really growing out of this GlassNet network of network project that's funded by the National Science Foundation, involves networks from different disciplines around the world. And our approach to thinking about issues and agricultural trade and sustainability in particular is a global to local to global. And I want to elaborate on that and help argue that this is a good lens through which we could view the issues we're talking about today. Next slide. So here's the idea. Global forces, we're all aware of those: population, income, trade policy, technology are driving a lot of stresses now, a lot of sustainability stresses. But these sustainability stresses are very localized. On average, the US has plenty of water, but there are many areas that are extremely stressed and other areas where there's flooding. So it's a local question. Local governance, local characteristics determine it. So the solutions have to also be local. Yet these local solutions can feed back, and I want to highlight that for you here today, how local responses to sustainability stresses can feed back through markets, through trade, to the regional and global levels. Next slide, please. So I'll talk about two examples, one where population and income growth are the main drivers, and one where we're really talking about productivity growth fueled by public research and development, something that OECD is very much committed to, and how that can also give rise to global, local, global interactions. Next slide, please. So here's an example of drivers of the agricultural system. By region, you can see projected growth rates to 2050 of population, income, and productivity. And you can see there's a lot of variation around the world. These drivers vary a great deal. And I'm going to focus just on the US here because that's where we've done some more elaborate calculations. Next slide, please. So how do these translate into production changes, crop production changes in the US? You could do something similar for any of these other countries around the world. But the striking thing about this figure is that the main drivers now of US crop production going into the future are not developments in the US. You can see on the right-hand side there, the US income growth is a small contributor in terms of all income growth to driving crop production, similar with population. So these are global drivers that matter. Closing yourself off to the world, obviously, would radically change the pattern of crop production in the US. Next slide, please. So these global drivers evidence themselves, though, at a local level in very different ways. So this is part of our global to local analysis, where statistical analysis has been done to understand where cropland conversion is likely to occur. And you can see projected cropland conversion overall is very modest, but quite different depending on locality, and very much of it concentrated in the marginal areas, the areas that tend to be more vulnerable in terms of erosion, water quality, and other considerations. So that's local responses being quite heterogeneous. Next slide, please. I want to focus specifically on groundwater, since that's really a big issue these days and a growing issue. And on the left-hand side, you see the ratio of withdrawals of groundwater to recharge. So if withdrawals are roughly equal to recharge, you're in a sustainable situation. Well, there's some numbers there that are as large as 10 or more. Central Valley of California, Upper Snake River Basin, and Ogallala, for example, being particularly stressed areas. And our projections suggest that we'll just add to that rather than resolving the problem. A business as usual scenario will add further to that going forward to 2050. Next slide, please. So one response is to say, okay, enough is enough. You cannot withdraw more than the recharge rate, and that's happening, beginning to happen in various locations. But what happens then is that the production, people still want to eat, you still, so what happens is the production tends to shift elsewhere. And this just shows you production shifting within the US as well as overseas. And in total, then we end up with more land use simply because we're taking out of production some very high yielding crop area. So there are these spillover effects, so we need to keep those in mind. And this is an example of local to global. So we already talked about global driving local, but now as you respond to this, there can be feedbacks both within the country, trade within the country, trade overseas, and that's an important factor to take into account. Next slide, please. So I want to turn now, we could look at more at land use, deforestation, other aspects. Glad to talk about that. Glad to talk about the afforestation efforts underway under climate mitigation and potential spillover effects from that. But I want to turn to a different topic that I know a lot of people are thinking about these days, OECD in particular, and that has to do with productivity. In principle, doing more with less is the very definition of sustainability. What are the trade dimensions of this? Let's talk about that. Next slide, please. So this draws on more than a decade of work with Keith Fugley and others. And here you can see a slide from a figure from a recent paper we published in Applied Economics Perspectives and Policy, just showing that in the US, since 1990, production's grown 40%. And yet input growth in aggregated in an economic sense, has not grown, nor have greenhouse gases. So that's been a benefit. It means lower greenhouse gas intensity of production. So that's a win, and productivity growth is good from that perspective. Next slide, please. And you can see this applies around the world. Of course, in developing countries, still strong population growth, strong dietary upgrading, and we can see growth in input. But there's still this gap between growth in output and growth in inputs, and growth in greenhouse gas emissions, which in the low middle income countries, they're growing even more slowly than inputs. So productivity, definitely a plus. What does it mean in a trade context? Let's go to the next slide, please. In a trade context, this is particularly important, of course, for countries in sub-Saharan Africa, many of whom are dependent on imports, will become more dependent on food imports likely in the future because of strong population growth rates and relatively stagnant productivity growth. This is taken from a paper that you can refer to later on if you want more details, but the main point here is that absent technological change, that's the no-tech scenario, crop prices could rise significantly in sub-Saharan Africa, particularly if there's no further integration of trade. So the segmented market scenario is something mimicking where we are right now. And sub-Saharan Africa is largely, to a great extent, insulated from trade due to many different things. It's not just trade policy, it's other trade frictions and barriers, poor infrastructure, and so on. So it's only when you bring in technology that you begin to see potential lower crop prices. And what's most striking to us in this paper, and this led us to coin the term, you heard from Valeria, virtual water trade, virtual land trade. We're talking here about virtual trade and technology. You do things better in one place, export the product more cheaply, others benefit. So this, hence Keith and I coined the term virtual technology trade. And you can see in the future going forward, that's very important in sub-Saharan Africa. Their own R&D simply isn't strong enough. The growth isn't strong enough. The conversion to productivity is not strong enough. CGIAR plays a role. Spillovers haven't played much of a role in sub-Saharan Africa historically. It's really this virtual technology trade benefiting from innovations elsewhere. So trade also important when it comes to technology. And now the last slide, I believe. So just to summarize, Jared, global forces driving many of today's sustainability stresses. Sustainability is inherently a local issue. We can't look at it nationally or regionally in most cases, but the solutions have to be local, but they can have global consequences. So I want people to be thinking about that. And I also want you to be thinking about the R&D, because the lag between spending in public R&D and productivity outcomes is very long. This is really your long game strategy. What you do today on this front isn't going to make much difference, but it's going to make a lot of difference when you're out a couple of decades. So for like the OECD, that's a place to be thinking about the long game as well. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tom. It's a lot of food for thought in that short 7-minute presentation. So thank you very much for that. So now we turn to the point. I'll just open up my chat screen as well for questions. And as per some of the other sessions, people have a question, feel free to raise a hand and we can go around, or to send a message in the chat. Maybe just to kick us off, I've got quite a few questions, but I'll just ask one, and relates to Tom, to the point you were talking about productivity and the driver there, and you highlighted the importance of R&D. I just know that in Australia's experience, it hasn't just been R&D, it's also been the opening and, I guess, producers facing the relative prices that a market will give them, those consumer signals, and it's been a reorganisation of production, as well as the technical change that's been driven out of R&D. Do you have thoughts on, I guess, how those things work together and the role of trade, I guess, and trade policy settings in that space?
No, that's a great point, Jared. You're right. If you look over the last few decades, and we've done that with Keith, kind of apportioning historical productivity growth to these different components. So public R&D, private R&D playing an increasingly important role in the rich countries, and reforms. So, I mean, the most striking outcome is, example is China, of course, where huge productivity growth due to their reforms. Australia, see it to some degree. These are things that you do one-off. You make the reform, you realize the gains, and that's great, reorganization along those lines. But to have this continuing benefit out into the future, it really does require moving the technology frontier out or catching up to that frontier. But the point's well taken, Jared. Yeah.
Excellent. Thanks, Tom. Valeria?
Yeah, just to add about this productivity, I think that it is a fascinating topic. So I think that also following with Tom just mentioned and Fugli's data, it is clearly that for developed countries, the greater growth of that TFP is really stabilizing a little bit for wheat and some other of those grains, but in other regions has not. So we've been doing a work with David Laborde, in which we're doing some scenarios about what would happen if we decrease or reduce that yield gap by region. And so it's clearly the huge impact that that will have in Africa compared to other regions. And so to say that is something very, very important to follow up if what we want to have at the very end is to have a global production that is higher with sustainability and all the things that we'll cover in this event. Thanks.
Excellent. Thanks, Valeria. I noticed we've got a couple of questions. I see one from Brazil. Carlos jumped in and then jumped back out. Maybe I'll turn to Carlos first and then go to Bernard from Canada.
Thank you. Thank you. I was struck by one of the lines that Valeria mentioned, which is you need to put the right incentives for the producers, and that is very much in line with what we have seen in our programs that promote sustainable agriculture. So because some of those techniques are bringing more productivity for the producers, they are uptaking it more in a speed which is faster than we expected, because of course they are profiting from that. And I think certainly that alignment seems very important. But I would have a question for her, if I understood correctly, what you showed there in terms of water and fertilizers in trade in China and US. Did I understand correctly that what you were saying is that what China saved in terms of water and fertilizers is more than they imported, which means by bringing in efficiency, you also brought in sustainable efficiencies. Is that correct? And then if Tom would agree with that reasoning, or whether he has a different take on that.
Over to you, Valeria, in the first instance, and then we'll go to Tom.
Sorry, I didn't know if you wanted to get all the questions and then answer. So thank you very much for the question. And the idea of that slide was just to use as an illustration. So I do think that you have to give the right incentives to producers to actually adopt these good technologies from the environment. And sometimes they are not very cost effective at the very beginning. It may be later on in life kind of thing, once that you adopt that technology. But so the point is that the incentive have to go with them in terms of assuring that they do have benefits in the short term, as well as bring them all the way to the longer term, so that they adopt the technology and they are efficient in that. So that figure, as I said, was just an illustration to say how trade, and that I think that it brings back to Tom's map, which I think that was a better way maybe to show it, in terms of some countries now, they are not producing it domestically, they are just importing those products from other countries. So that we need to make sure that if we're thinking it in a global aspect, that we are not just sending the inefficiencies somewhere else, so that everybody should pick it up and use the good technology. So, and to really just use the better endowments of natural resources that you have, but that doesn't mean that you don't have to produce sustainably as well. Thank you.
Jared, I could follow up briefly on that too. Given that Carlos raised the question and mentioned China, it brought immediately to mind the Brazil-China relationship, which is obviously really important and very dynamic and significant in the world stage and in an environmental context. And I guess to the extent, perhaps he was alluding to the point, to the extent Chinese are using more fertilizer or somehow more environmentally intensive elements, perhaps that's advantageous. In the global environmental sense, I would bring up one point in my reading of that literature. There are many dimensions to it, but one has to do with just governance of land, governance of the environment. And there have been some sociologists and anthropologists who've studied governance between China and Brazil and argued that some of this relationship has to do with weaker governance in Brazil than in China. I'd be interested in his comments on that. But it's not just the resources, it's also how they're managed. And that's an interesting question. I don't know enough to answer it definitively, but that's an interesting point.
Thanks, Tom. It might be worth bringing Alan in. I know, Alan, you've done some work in these type of issues. Do you have any comments you'd like to add to this debate?
Thanks, Jared. Just maybe to make a comment from my own observations that, of course, where we can find win-win outcomes, both for farmers' incomes, for production and for the environment, of course, we should exploit those opportunities. For example, greater nitrogen use efficiency is an obvious example. Or improved animal health, for example, which both improves production, farmers' bottom line, and also can contribute to lower greenhouse gas emissions. But I would warn that there seem to be limits to the extent to which we can actually rely on these win-win opportunities, and that often there is going to be a trade-off between maximizing your production and also trying to protect elements of your environment. And even where we emphasize productivity, certainly at a national level, I mean, you can have this so-called Jevons paradox, that by increasing the efficiency of production, yes, you reduce, for example, greenhouse gas emissions per unit of output, but because your production is now more efficient, it becomes more competitive on the world market, and therefore absolute size of that sector expands. Martin will be familiar with the Irish dairy industry in this context, where we have improved output, greenhouse gas emission intensity per unit of output, but we have also expanded the dairy herd significantly. So yes, of course, we should exploit these win-win opportunities, but there are going to be difficult political trade-offs, in my view, as well.
Thanks very much, Alan. Carlos, I think you've just got a quick little comment to add in. Do you want to do that? Then I'll go to Bernard.
If I may, my point is exactly that. Okay, you increase productivity because you're efficient, then your absolute production is bigger. But then the question is whether you are exporting to someone who, because is less efficient, would be less sustainably efficient. Meaning, it's true, I augmented my absolute production, but in a more sustainable way from a global perspective. That's the point. I'm interested to know whether evidence shows things going in that direction. Because then the next step would say, well, if you distort that and you include subsidies that would provide for increasing production in a country which is less sustainable in terms of its production, then you have a double jeopardy. You have a subsidy that distorts markets and distorts sustainability as well.
I think that's an excellent point. Valeria, do you want to just jump in?
I really like what you just said, actually. I think that we also did a work on repurposing agricultural subsidies, in which we just did some scenarios about what happens if we eliminate border measures. And then the other one was something about subsidies, domestic support. But the thing of trade liberalization was exactly what you just said. So once that you do that, there's a shifting in production globally. And we're moving to, so production was going to increase, and you ended up having exactly what you just mentioned. I think that what it will be interesting for the researcher point of view is to really work on methodologies that can really measure well all the gas emissions, but with respect of carbon sequestration and different technologies. So I think that was what we're missing. We always, in general, have the same coefficients, or at least that they are static. It would be great if we can really get the right measurements and things to be able to just do these matrix in which we have these changes in technologies with line change used, and at the same time with the different technologies used by country. And even if it is with more disaggregation, even better, but I think that we can't even get that right now. So that's a work in progress, but that goes exactly what you just mentioned. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Valeria. I'm here to that comment about those better emissions intensity estimates. Bernard, jump in.
Yeah, that may be a weird question, but it's something I picked up from Valeria and Thomas's presentation. So Valeria, you talked about a scenario where you look at potential increases in productivity in Africa mostly, I guess. And I suspect South Asia or parts of South Asia might also be included in that rationale in my question. So, you know, of course, the question is how do you get there? But assuming, you know, apart from virtual technology trade, if you get there, somehow I would assume, and I'm wondering if you looked at that there are less pressures in some exporting regions when speak of countries, given that, you know, there's less demand for exports or imports in that case. Does that contribute in any way to better resource use overall, or decreases in GHG emissions overall? And of course, you can see the underlying reasoning. You know, wouldn't it be faster to increase productivity in Africa collectively than doing each country doing their small things? Or, you know, of course, if we could get to all of it together, it would be better. But I'm just wondering if you looked at that from a scenario analysis. Hope that's clear enough. Sorry.
Yes, and if it is okay, Jared, I will answer right now.
Yeah.
So this is a work we're doing for FAO. So I am so for the SOCO report that it is coming up. So I don't know how much I can say about this in detail because it hasn't been published. But one thing I can tell you is that we only looked at productivity scenarios compared with trade liberalizations or improvements in institutions and infrastructure. So there were 3 sets of scenarios. We didn't look into emissions or anything like that. So it was just more in perspective of what are the development strategies that are there. What are the difference between investing in just productivity versus some other investment strategies, for example. So we do have we could go to that point and look at all those indicators as well, but that was not part of what I was just mentioning. Thanks.
Thanks, Valeria. Tom, you got your hand up?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question that was raised. I got into a heated debate with a geographer when I was on sabbatical at Stanford a few years ago, and ended up in writing a paper for the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science exactly on this issue. Green Revolution in Africa, trade integration, how do they interact? And it turns out to be a very interesting question, and it relates to Alan's point about Jevons paradox as well. So in the current environment, again, still not well integrated into trade, many of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa, if you have these domestic innovations, they're going to contribute primarily to lower food prices. You're not going to get a lot of area expansion. I mean, if you only have a local market, you produce more, the price falls, you're not going to have the incentive to do the Jevons thing and expand. So not so great for producers, but great for consumers, maybe pretty good for the environment too. Now turn it around and look at this kind of integrated market scenario I laid out in my talk, which is like trade economist nirvana. Just a big bathtub out there, and you throw stuff in and get it out, and there's one price and everyone trades happily. In that kind of a world, you invest heavily in sub-Saharan Africa. What's going to happen is exactly what Alan was talking about in Ireland. If you're well integrated in the world market and you improve yields, you're going to have a great expansion in area. And so we really highlighted the environmental costs of that and the need to compare that with some kind of a protection of the most carbon rich, the most biodiverse areas. So I think these things go hand in hand, and this is a theme about trade. And it's not just that we trade, but we could trade more intensively or less intensively. And I don't know what direction we're going in the future. When we wrote that paper, we were sure we were headed for trade economist nirvana. Now, I'm not so sure. Anyway, excellent question. Very interesting point.
Excellent. Thanks, Tom. Notice, Tom, we've got 2 minutes before we have to hand back to Leanne to sum up. So maybe if I could just go around the panelists and start with you, Alan, and just a quick observation on what you think the OECD should focus on here in terms of their analysis. Like, what's the best next step that they could take?
Yeah, I mean, I think traditionally, of course, we trade economists have focused on sort of tariffs and, yes, to some extent, non-tariff barriers. But I think integrating the fact that countries will introduce sustainability standards, I use that term in the broadest, it can be health, climate, environment, human rights, and so on, will be introducing these at different rates. You know, that is going to influence the spatial direction of trade flows. It will influence relative competitiveness. It will set up these political economy reactions that I referred to earlier. I think that could be a really interesting point to focus on in your future work at the OECD. Yeah, thanks.
Excellent. Thanks, Alan. Valeria?
I actually really like what Alan just said. But I think that one thing that I would add is that I do think, even though there were some discussions in the second panel, but I do think that there needs to be some level of harmonization, so that if there's no kind of surprises, there's no differences, that then they can be used as NTBs, non-trade measures. So I think that we need to really emphasize in methodologies, and so that it is science-based and that there are some minimum standards that they need to be doing. And then again, like it was mentioned before, if then somebody wants to increase it a little bit or do something extra, it could be a good idea. But at least the minimum, it will be good for developing countries or LDCs to really know at least what they need to be doing. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. And Tom? I think we got you on mute, okay. Tom. Yeah. I mean, you're back on mute.
Okay, now, sorry. Let me go back to the point I was just making, thinking about trade, interaction between trade and the environment. I think when all is said and done, it's still about land use when it comes to agriculture. Agriculture is the main driver of biodiversity loss around the world. It's still land conversion, deforestation that's generating the biggest carbon emissions from agriculture. And that's an area we can increasingly monitor. All of these other non-CO2 emissions and so on, getting a grip on those, regulating them is going to be very difficult. So I think we still need to focus on land use. Trade as a driver of land use change. And when you have these surges in trade and you don't protect the sensitive lands, you get bad outcomes. So I'd like to focus there.
That's a great point. Thanks, Tom. And I've gone over a couple of minutes, so I'll stop and I'll hand back to Leanne. So, but thank you everyone for a very interesting panel. We could have kept them going.
I know, I wish we had more time, but I know we're wrapping up. Thanks so much, Jared, and thanks to this panel, and thanks to everyone who's participated today. I see we've had a really great sustained participation. We will circulate a link to the recording and also PDF versions of those presentations for people who want to go revisit some of the insights that our experts shared. I'd like to really sincerely thank all of the speakers and also the moderators for your time and for your willingness to engage in such a dynamic way. It's not always easy in the virtual setting, so I really appreciate it. And also keeping to time, which is important for everyone who's participating. And then also I would just finally like to acknowledge again this contribution from Australia, which allowed us to bring all of this together today. Following this workshop, we're going to prepare a report which will discuss the issues that were described here and hopefully contribute to some additional understanding of this system of sustainable agricultural production and trade, highlighting some of the issues that our experts have also raised, and also the discussions that came in from the floor. As I've noted already, the OECD has been working in this space for some time, but clearly there's lots of new technologies, new issues that we can be chewing on in the future. Before closing, just let me highlight quickly that we have 2 flagship publications that are coming out soon. The annual OECD Agricultural Policy Monitoring and Evaluation Report is coming out, and also my team's Agricultural Outlook, which we do in collaboration with FAO. So we'll have those 10-year projections out in about 2 weeks. So keep an eye out for those. They both have some focus on how agriculture can meet climate targets and food security goals. So also relevant to the discussions we've been having today. So I'll close there. I don't see any emergency reactions from other colleagues, and just thank everybody again for joining us, and wish you all a very good day.